and Councilmember Gilbert Cedillo. This is the Ad hoc on Homelessness Committee. This is the first meeting of this committee. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here to address perhaps one of the most important issues facing the city of Los Angeles. As many of you know, homelessness is an epic crisis both in the city and the county. And we, quite frankly, as the CAO report showed, the city has not had a comprehensive plan on how to address issues of homelessness. And given where the city has been spending funds, perhaps there's a better way of spending our limited dollars on the most effective approaches. We hope that through this committee, we will set out a strategic plan for the city to follow in terms of approaching the issues of homelessness in a much better fashion. Quite frankly, our past approach has been reactionary to litigation through injunctions and settlements, and that's no way to set policy for the city in any matter. And we hope to be proactive by setting out a strategic plan for the city that hopefully we could get done in about 6 months, and also have some recommended dollar amounts so that come the next fiscal year we will be in place to make the case to the mayor, to our colleagues, that we better invest in homelessness throughout the city. Now, granted, our jurisdiction is on cleanliness of streets and safety of streets. That is our primary responsibility as a city. But I think the issue is of such large proportions and a humanitarian one that we hopefully will also challenge our counter-governmental, our other governmental agencies to better approach this and to work on this collectively. The CAO report set out some specific recommendations. We will hear that later. We also hope to hear from LASA on what is the current status of homelessness throughout the region. And we have a 6-month agenda already that we've laid out that I will read out toward the end of the committee. I do want to first get started right away. And at the end of the committee, I will lay out what the agenda will be for the rest of these committees. I ask my colleagues on this ad hoc and the public, if you do have any input or comments on what the 6-month agenda is, to please let me, my office know. Martin Schlageter in my office and Sarah Hernandez are my staff for this committee. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleagues for any opening remarks they may have. And first, let me turn it over to the vice chair of this committee, Mike Bonin. And before I do that, I do want to thank Council President Herb Wesson for having the foresight and the interest in creating an ad hoc for us to move forward. We also want to thank our mayor, Garcetti, for having a coordinator for homelessness issues. Mr. Spiegel's here in the back, so we want to welcome him as well. So we look forward to working on this collectively, not only within the city family, but also with the various stakeholders and organizations who have been doing tremendous work to address this issue, and other governmental entities. So with that, let me turn it over to our council vice chair, Mike Bonin. Mr. Bonin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank everybody for coming today. We have a crisis in the city of Los Angeles. Homelessness is an incredible crisis that has been getting worse. It's not a crisis that anybody should have been woken up to when LASA released the results of its count a couple months ago. But it's a crisis that has now, I think, finally, at long last, captured the attention and the focus of this council and of this city. And I'm very hopeful that through this committee we will be able to do, as the chair just outlined, develop a strategy and a plan to harness the city's resources to match those that we are seeing at so many other levels of government. This crisis is a state of emergency. We need to declare a state of emergency about homelessness in the city of Los Angeles. The problem with homelessness in Los Angeles is as great as the problem with water in the state of California. We have a drought of housing and a drought of services and a drought of resources, and we have to bring those resources and that housing to bear. I think we're at a unique moment of partnership and ready action with not just a community hungry for action, but partners at all different levels of government. Our mayor has made ending veteran homelessness by the end of this year or the very beginning of next one of his top priorities. The federal government has appointed a new VA secretary who is turning the VA facility in my district into what is going to be, I think, a shining example of what the federal government can do for veterans homelessness. At the county, I think we have a level of partnership that we have never seen before. In my district, I'm very grateful to have Sheila Kuehl and Mark Ridley Thomas that we're working very closely with. But I think it's a time where the county is extending its hand in partnership with the city like I haven't seen before. And on the civic level, Home for Good over the past 5 years, a partnership between the United Way and the Chamber, has done tremendous work in getting us to move here in Los Angeles to a housing first model. I'm often asked, why can't the city of Los Angeles do what Salt Lake City has done? That's exactly what we want to do. That's exactly what the plan has been in Los Angeles. That's exactly what Home for Good and the coordinated entry system has been leading on and trying to do. In fact, I think in Los Angeles we have over the past few years housed more people than Salt Lake City has. But our problem is one of scale. It is considerably greater in terms of numbers, in terms of cost, and so our work is much greater. On this committee, I hope that we're prepared to seize this moment in Los Angeles. We can't have 15 different ad hoc approaches in 15 different council districts, and we can't continue to make LAPD the first responder of choice to issues of homelessness. For me, I think some of the elements to having a smart, coordinated strategy out of the city of Los Angeles has sort of 4 principles for me. One is that we need to build on success by better allocating our resources to partner with those that are there. I think Home for Good and the coordinated entry system have given us a framework that we should be trying to feed into and partner with and synchronize with rather than trying to recreate the wheel. We need, 2, to identify ways to jumpstart our inventory of housing here in Los Angeles, permanent supportive housing for as many people as possible. And 3, I think we need to acknowledge that while housing first is our principle, housing only is not enough. We have in Los Angeles, in this county, over 40,000 people who are homeless. And on any given night, 29,000 people of them in the county sleep on the street. They're unsheltered. 19,000 of them in the city, unsheltered. And our only option can't be one of the few and diminishing shelter beds or permanent supportive housing on one end and the sidewalk on the other. We have to come up with a humane continuum of options that includes shared housing, transitional housing, emergency shelters, transitional shelters, specialized shelters. There has to be a range of options. And finally, the 4th principle is I think here in the city of LA, we need to have a grown-up conversation that no matter how much money we spend and how quickly we spend it, tomorrow and next month and next year, there are still going to be people sleeping on the sidewalks. And we need to resource that properly. And that means that until we have the ability to house everybody, we need to have voluntary storage for people, and we need to have bathrooms for people, and we need to make sure that those who are not given an alternative by us or by the resources we bring to bear in partnership with the other levels of government have humane options to live with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And now if we could, any opening remarks, Mr. Cedillo?
Sure.
And just for the record,
my colleagues,
the record, we've been joined by Councilmember Curran Price. Would you want me to go over here first?
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Price, any opening remarks?
I'm hopeful that we will be able to come up really with some comprehensive solutions that make sense. And we all are impacted by this crisis. I live right around the corner from the shelter on 38th Street and Broadway, and it's just heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking to see people in need on the sidewalk, especially those who don't want to be on the sidewalk. Some do want to be on the sidewalk. We need to try to find some help for them too. But those who who don't want to be there, who want some help, who have families. We just have to do a better job. And so I just agree it has to be a comprehensive approach. Certainly, housing, permanent housing is part of that equation, but also supportive services that make sense. Leveraging limited resources. We got to work better with our county resources. We got to make sure that the state is doing its job. And so I just am interested in seeing how we can leverage the limited resources necessary to do the job at hand. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the.
Thank you, Mr. Price.
Appreciate your presence.
Mr. Cedillo?
Sure. I concur, obviously, with my colleagues, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership. You've been a strong voice in bringing us together and working with the President of the Council and the Mayor, making sure that we're here today to do this. You are right in characterizing this as a crisis, and it should be addressed as such. There's many causes that for people being homeless. Poverty is one. Immigration status is another. Women who flee domestic violence frequently find themselves on the streets. Many on the streets struggle with drug abuse or alcohol abuse. Many are mentally ill. That children who leave foster care, within 6 months, half the children who leave foster care in the county of Los Angeles are on the streets of Los Angeles. Many veterans come home, and whether they have a place to stay or unable to, and we find them on the streets. And any combination of those things also are reasons for people being on the streets. For those 19,000 people, they all have one thing in common, though. They all need a place to stay. And we have to respond to that. Each and every single one of them needs their own individual strategy to confront the challenges that they have. There's not a one-size-fits-all. But there is one commonality to it, and that's each and every single one needs a place to stay. And so we can do that. We must do that. I'm happy to hear when people talk about the need for housing, because as chair of housing, and we will offer up through housing a series of reforms. Mr. Fuentes brought some forward last week, a series of reforms that will add to the housing stock. But quite frankly, we need a housing boom. We need a revolution. We need a change both of mind and of conduct and of policy that helps us proliferate housing in the city of Los Angeles. We need to think about housing differently, from market rate to special needs to low income to affordable, and we need to think differently about the size of housing. I'm sure most people sleeping in tents tonight would welcome a 500, 600 square foot unit in lieu of that tent. I don't doubt that. And if we had that I'm sure that many would take advantage of that. So we need all of that. We also need a change in how we think about public space and how we think about the civic infrastructure that Mr. Bonin mentioned. We need clean restrooms that are public restrooms that are clean and safe and accessible, that are lit. We need public space that's public friendly, and that applies to our parks and to our libraries. We need water faucets. Think about what dehydration does to us on any given day, and think about that as a permanent condition or a daily condition and what that does for us. And so we need a whole different attitude about civic infrastructure. But finally, what we need is a change in our strategies. And so I will concur with you that we cannot criminalize our way out of this. We cannot police our way out of this. It's unfair to all the participants. Those young men and women who went to the academy to become police officers did not come and go to the academy to solve homelessness. If that was their challenge, initially they would have gone to UCLA School of Social Work or SC School of Social Policy or Occidental School of Public Policy. That's not why those young men and women went to the academy. They went to go fight crime. And it shouldn't be a crime to be poor or homeless. On the other hand, those who are shouldn't be treated as that. And we can't criminalize our way out of this. We can't ticket our way out of this. We can't continue to think that this policy can be driven by, with all due respect, by the city attorney's office or by Police Chief Beck. This is our responsibility. We are the policymakers of this city, and it's for us to construct a public policy in housing and in public space that matches the challenges that confront us with homelessness in the city. And so we have to change our perspective, and we have to change our practices and stop thinking that we can criminalize our way out of this. It's difficult for me to say this. I was a champion and a cohort with Police Chief Bill Bratton. I believe in the broken window theory in the appropriate circumstance. The challenge in this instance is that we cannot fix a broken window that's not attached to a home. It just does not work. It will never solve our problems. And so we need to move forward with a new direction and a new look and a new perspective. And for that, Mr. President, I thank you for your leadership in this effort.
Thank you so much. So with that, we'll get started and ask for item number 1 to be called. And item number 1, if you could read that into the record, please.
Sure. Item number 1, motion, Fuentes Huizar, relative to a presentation by the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority of the 2015 homeless count results.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Huizar, Vice Chair Bonin, council members. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak about the results of the count and to speak through some of the findings that we have for the City of Los Angeles, the demographics, and then address a little bit some of the drivers and some of the mitigating factors for the numbers that we found.
If you could identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Sorry.
We know who you are.
I apologize. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm Peter Lin. I'm the Executive Director for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. LASA is a joint powers authority between the city and the county to address homeless services across the LA continuum of care, which does not include the cities of Glendale, Long Beach, and Pasadena, but all the rest of the county of Los Angeles. So homeless counts are a federal mandate. We are required as a community to count the homeless on a biennial census basis that includes all of the people on the street and all the people in our temporary and sheltered environment. Los Angeles homeless count is the largest in the country. So New York has more homeless people and is a sort of larger by number, but most of their people are sheltered. In the organizational requirements for getting out and counting the census tracts covering the county of Los Angeles, which is vastly larger, makes it the largest count in the nation. 5,500 volunteers participated in this count. They fanned out across the county, covering census tracts from Antelope Valley all the way down to San Pedro. What this count does is it gives a snapshot of one given night. So it is a moment in time. It does not speak to inflows or outflows. It does not speak to like how many people are going to pass through homelessness in a given time. It is a one snapshot. We have been conducting these counts for the past 10 years on a biennial basis. Every year we do a shelter count, but we do not do a street survey except every other year. This year being an exception. We are going to do a 2016 count. Thank you for budgeting that. We also got funding from the county for their portion. So we will be conducting a full count for 2016. There are 4 components. There is the street count, which is where the volunteers participate. There's enumeration of census tracts. We get a statistical sample. We try to count as many as we can, and they count persons and they count makeshift dwellings, which includes vehicles and so forth. There's a shelter count, which covers our emergency shelter system, our transitional housing, which is a temporary model. That covers our safe havens. It covers things like the Grand Per Diem program from the Veterans Affairs. It covers people who are in motels and hotels through voucher programs, like from DPSS and so forth. In addition, we do a demographic survey. So the street count counts people, but we don't know the characteristics of those people because the volunteers don't encounter them that way. Layered on top of that, we do a demographic survey so we go out and we fan out across the city and the county with paid persons who do an in-depth survey instrument. We do thousands of those surveys across the entire region, and we do a statistically valid sample in order to get the characteristics of the population. We then use that data to layer over the street count information so that we have a good demographic profile of who are homeless and what their characteristics are in our geography. We also capture demographics through the shelter count because those data are captured on a regular basis in HMIS. Those shelter count localities that are not participating in HMIS, so for example, the missions or other things like that, we would do a survey to them and we capture demographic information from them. So every aspect of this count gets a demographic component. And we also conduct a youth count. This is an area where there's a lot of change and a lot of deliberation about the way to do a youth count, and the exact methodologies are still in development. But the effort there is to make sure that we are understanding and capturing all of youth who are not necessarily going to be visible during the overnight street count. This is just to give a visual of the footprint of the 2015 count. 90% of the census tracts in the County of Los Angeles were covered by this count. So it was an extraordinary depth of coverage. We got to almost every place. And if you look, they look like big areas that are not counted there, but those are pretty wild and woolly areas of the county. Those are wilderness, basically. Almost every other portion we got to, 90% of the tracts. Obviously, the shaded areas are not our continuum. Those are the responsibility of those continuum of care. Let's just talk through findings for the city. Found 26,000 homeless persons in the city of Los Angeles. That's an increase of about 12% over the 2013 census. If you look at the distribution of homelessness in the Los Angeles continuum of care, it's about 62% of that is city of LA. So between the distributions on our county side and our city side, about two-thirds, just under two-thirds are homeless persons in the city of Los Angeles. On the continuum, which is, again, less those cities, 35,500 was the 13 population, 41.2 is the population in 2015. So that's an increase of about 16% or 5,600 individual people. And then county-wide, which includes our neighboring continua of care, the overall increase was about 12%, so their numbers actually decreased, which slightly counterbalanced the overall increase in the County of Los Angeles. So total persons, 44,359. Now just to, I want to emphasize that these numbers are an estimate. So the level of precision that's implied by a number ending in 59 it's not that level of precision. Something on the order, it's more than 44,000. These are estimates. We are out counting people on the street. We are making extrapolations from the demographic data that we gather about how many persons are in each of these makeshift dwelling types. So it is an estimate. What it's very useful for is difference in magnitude of difference from the last count. We count by council district, so we do have a breakdown, and we do have demographics for council districts, which we have been providing out to the offices. The demographic precision is less for council districts because we don't get as many samples per council district as we get for the whole geography. But the greatest density is found in CD 14, CDs 8, 9, and 13 also have quite significant densities as well. But certainly the growth patterns can also be seen through comparing the demographics and the count data from one census to the next. And these data are available on our website. They're also available in tables. We'll make this presentation available. Just it's a little bit of too rich information to present in a slide, but these generally offer up some density patterns to the population, and so these are census tracts within the CDs, and it gives us sort of an overall footprint within the city of LA of where the highest density areas are. So obviously the shading is indicating greater densities. We did put on our website a set of maps that allow for some different geographies to be scaled through and to get different kinds of demographics from that. So if you look at the LAHSA Homeless Count website, there are a number of different geographies on this, and we're continuously updating those information and adding demographics as we get them. One of the notable features was an increase in dwelling types. So that includes vehicular homelessness, people in cars and vans and RVs. It also includes tents and makeshift shelters. So of those 5 kinds of dwelling structures, there's a considerable increase count on count. Now, part of that increase is also due to an increase in the census tract coverage from the count. So when we do so the way the count works is we sample and we count. We have a random sample of census tracts that we must count to give us a good population sample. We then extrapolate to the census tracts that we did not count using the data that we did. But the more tracts we count over and above the required sample, the better the accuracy. In 2011, we covered about half the tracts. In 2013, we covered about 70%. And in 2015, we got to about 90% of the census tracts. So we really saturated. But the extrapolation does not take into account makeshift shelters. So before the extrapolation happens, those are converted into a number of persons. That number is then covered into the extrapolated areas. So about half of the increase is explained by the phenomenon of more counting. However, that means half of the increase is not explained by that. It is an actual increase in makeshift dwellings and vehicles. And so these are large magnitude increases, and about half of them are explained by more counting. So these are very, very significant increases in the number of makeshift dwellings. I hope that was clear. Probably not. The proportion of the population in the city of LA that is sheltered stayed about flat. The increase that we saw was in unsheltered persons. So there is the percentage of people unsheltered has increased in this city and in the continuum. The shelter includes transitional programs. Some of those converted into permanent supportive housing in the interim period. So there is a process whereby we can convert transitional into permanent housing. This does not represent shelter beds lost. Just looking at a few of the demographics, there is an increase in women as a proportion of the total population. For the first time this time, we counted people who are identified as transgender. There is no comparative data in the earlier data, so we don't have a comparative there, but we do have a baseline from this count. By ethnicity, about half the population are identify as African American, and the distributions, they're a little bit challenging to see here. In the tabular form, we can present that. It's about a quarter Caucasian, about a quarter Latino, and about half African American. Looking at some of the other details under the demographics for the city of LA, these are data related to the city, not the continuum as a whole. They're similar to. Chronically homeless individuals increased dramatically. Now that's driven by, in part by the overall number going up. It's in part driven by a change in the federal definition, which added some factors to the survey instrument. We asked questions that might not have been picked up under the general disability rubric earlier, like traumatic brain injury, like post-traumatic stress disorder, like chronic illness, that added to this number. So we are pulling apart now a sort of, baseline comparable against the earlier data. We don't, right now we show a significant increase, and this is the chronically homeless population. It's not directly comparable to the earlier numbers. A quarter of the population in the city report severe mental illness. We had, a significant, or significant increases in the experience of domestic violence. Part of that also is driven by the definition. So where there were more questions asked, including questions about stalking, questions about dating violence, and questions about sexual assault, that added a lot of positive answers to that question. So we're looking at those data as well. So some of the mitigating factors, obviously these data show an increase. There's no question about that. At the same time, the continuum has been housing people at a very rapid pace. So between the programs that we have for families, for veterans, and for chronically homeless persons, we have housed thousands of individuals and families. But for the enormous amount of collaborative work housing folks, these numbers would have been worse. Obviously, we are not keeping pace with the housing with the housing people that we have, but we do have an enormous number of people being placed into permanent housing. These are all very hard countable data, and it does not include a large number of people who are single adult individual homeless folks. We're putting together right now a tracking mechanism to cover all the people who are passing through that. So there's a data effort right now to pull together all the data sources and all the individuals who are housed. We don't have one single source for all those data right now. Driving this at core is an affordability crisis in LA, and I think that has been touched on by many folks. There are many different data sources that point to this same outcome. We have one of the worst overcrowding in housing populations. We have one of the highest rent burdens of American cities. We have folks doubled up. We have the gap in affordability, the gap between what rents are and what wages are being earned is one of the worst in America. By multiple metrics, we have an affordability crisis on housing side. At core, homelessness is a housing problem. It is not only a housing problem, but that is the basic problem, is that there is a dearth of housing. There are numerous different indicators that point to affordability. Wage base, particularly at the lowest end, is also eroding. Obviously, with the work on the City Council to raise the minimum wage, that is an enormously important step. Benefits have not kept pace with inflation. They certainly are not keeping pace with the rental market increases. Things like that have a real impact on folks here. The unemployment rate still being higher than the state has an impact. Another notable feature of the count was that in our continuum, the veteran number, despite the increase in 16% in the overall population, veterans essentially stayed flat from 4,007 to 4,016. That's not a meaningful difference in the accuracy level of this kind of count. What that, basically by comparison, that would factor as a 16% decrease. So what you would have seen would have been a number quite a bit higher, but for an enormous effort to house veterans and an enormous infusion of resources to house veterans over the past several years. One of the factors that I think took folks by surprise was the rate of inflow. New folks are becoming homeless at a faster rate, and veterans are becoming homeless. Some are cycling through in and out of homelessness, but new veterans are becoming homeless at a rate faster than was projected by the models that we had. So there is an overall decrease in the veteran homeless population across the county of Los Angeles, but that's factoring in the other two continua. In our continuum, it was flat. In the city of LA, there was a slight increase. So, a modest increase in the city of LA side. About, over the same period of the count, the continuum housed 7,500 veterans. So, that's essentially to keep the count flat to house 7,500 individuals. The implication meaning that many people fell into homelessness at the same period. As was expressed by some of the discussion earlier, we are working to build out a systemic infrastructure. We have numerous partners on the county side, on the city side, on the nonprofit and philanthropic side. Home for Good has spearheaded a collaborative for chronic and veterans. We have a homeless family solution center system that has been put together with county resources and city dollars to house our homeless families, and we have a very solid infrastructure there. We need to continue to resource this infrastructure and build it out so that it has scale to address the kind of population size that we're seeing in this town. We need to put more resources behind that. We need to prioritize the resources that we have to the folks who are at greatest risk and greatest need within those populations. Obviously, we need to continue to improve the coordination that we have among all the resources that we have. So we're layering in employment opportunities, we're layering in all of the various kinds of services, and we are tightly coordinated between outreach to crisis housing, navigation into permanent housing, and the support services afterwards, and we're moving people through permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, out into the community when they're ready. We also need to go upstream and address prevention and ensure that, we are making sure that there is affordability in the housing market. We are preventing institutional inflows, whether that's from the criminal justice system, it's from the health and hospital system, it's from the foster system. We need to address it from the Department of Defense when people are demobilized, that they're not released out into a situation of housing instability. We need to look at institutional inflows, and we need to make sure that service connections are very, very tight, and that people who are suffering from mental illness get treatment and they're met where they need to be. Talk through some of the resources that have been deployed and are in deployment and growing and are serving thousands of individuals. Obviously, there are many thousands of individuals who are not yet have access to the housing resources that are being deployed through these systems. Just to talk through a few new resources, City Housing Authority won the largest award in federal history for new permanent supportive housing rental assistance for chronically homeless persons last year. There's an enormous HUD federal vote of confidence in Los Angeles to award. So just to put it in perspective, there was a bonus round of money available for homeless services nationally of $40 million. They gave a quarter of it to Los Angeles. There's a huge vote of confidence in the collaborative structures that we put in together. We also received the largest award of VASH vouchers in the country. And we got one of the largest awards of supportive services for veterans' families. Those pieces of infrastructure are very important, and they're desperately needed. But if you look at these are in terms of hundreds of individuals, and we're talking in terms of thousands and tens of thousands of folks. That concludes the slide presentation. I would be happy to entertain questions or clarify any of the points in the presentation.
Sure, thank you. And first, thank you so much for working to release the information quickly and some usable formats for the public on this. And the reason we started off with this agenda item was to get a kind of a baseline data information out there so that we could get a sense of where we are in terms of this situation. Later in the agenda, we have the next on the agenda is some CAR report, and then after that, some immediate action items. And again, just to repeat, hopefully we could come up with a strategic plan within the next 6 months. And there's some immediate issues we could do within those 6 months. So we're not going to say, hey, we're going to wait till 6 months before we start actually doing some action. We have some immediate things we could be doing in the interim. But let's begin with some questions here to understand the data and what's before us. I have a couple of first questions, and then I'll invite my colleagues. And it's my understanding that in Long Beach and Glendale, we actually saw a decrease of homelessness in the same period. Any sense what you could attribute that to, or a sense of why that's the case?
So each of the neighboring continua saw a decrease. So that includes Pasadena, Glendale, and Long Beach. There is so we are working closely with them and talking with them. And so the coordinated entry system, for example, includes those continua as well. We are collaborating with them and looking at them. They have really good collaborative infrastructures, and we're certainly talking through what lessons learned and the different approaches that each of those continue to take. They're taking, they each sort of take a different approach, and they have different levels of challenge. They are much more homogeneous jurisdictions, and they don't have the same level of coordination that happens between, the city and the county and the many cities across this continua. So that is one of the things that we need to emphasize is the level of collaboration, the level of coordination. that we need to apply is a little different from a smaller, more homogeneous jurisdiction. It requires more of us.
Gotcha. And secondly, the one thing that struck me, and I'm sure struck a lot of folks, is the dramatic increase in whatever you want to call it, encampments,
Yes.
people living in cars. What can that be attributed to other than just the objective data that we've seen? Do you get a sense of what LASA's view of this is?
So it's a really good and complex question. Obviously, the percentage of people unsheltered in our continuum, 70% of the population is unsheltered. That's an awful lot of people who are exposed to the elements who are on the street. The numbers of people in vehicles, there is some indication that prefigures folks whose housing status is deteriorating rapidly. So people may lose their housing situation but retain their vehicle. They essentially, move from a housing situation with a vehicle to housing in the vehicle. The problem is that, with financial instability, they then, the vehicle will eventually fail out at a certain point. So there may be some sort of a continuum in that sense. There are a lot of people who have been on the street for quite a while now, so they're taking shelter within whatever infrastructure they can. There's some it's not entirely clear what other drivers there are.
Okay, great, thank you. And my final question on this is, when we recently did our outreach in Northeast Los Angeles, we found that the individuals living in the streets in Northeast Los Angeles, in Eagle Rock, Highland Park, they were actually local folks who are from that area. Do you get the sense that, can we extrapolate from that to say, other than Skid Row, who I think, correct me if I'm wrong, are people mostly coming into the area, is that pretty much the same for throughout the county and the city, that people who are living in the street in those areas are local individuals?
Yes. The great majority of these folks are Angelenos by any measure. So
even in Skid Row?
Skid Row. So there are three areas that we're looking at particularly. Obviously, Skid Row is one of them. It has a concentration of individuals for a variety of reasons, and there are two other populations that we're looking at in particular for this question. One being sort of Hollywood, and one being sort of West Side. But the overwhelming majority of the data from the continuum and from the city are that these folks are Angelenos. So if you look at, we asked the question, how long have you been in LA? And we asked the question, where were you last stably housed? And the overwhelming majority of both those questions indicate that these folks are Angelenos. So 93% of the people have been in Los Angeles for more than a year. 93%. And, 83% have been here more than 3 years. It's a very, very large number of people who have been here for a long time. 77% have been here more than 10 years, and that includes about 40% who were born here. When you look at where people were last stably housed, 71% indicate that was Los Angeles County. So there are, another sort of 10% from other parts of California, particularly Southern California, and then about 15% say out of state. Now, one of the challenging factors is there's a correlating kind of question, which is, were you homeless when you got here, or did you come here with a temporary situation and sort of hope to make it, and it didn't work, and now you're sort of, people come to Los Angeles with hopes and dreams and aspirations of, financial independence and stability, and that doesn't work out, and then they're trapped here. That's a different kind of question. We didn't ask that question, but the overwhelming majority of the people that were surveyed would be, residents by any rational standard.
Great, thank you. And before I go on, just want to remind the public, anybody here, we do want to hear from you. If you have a comment to make, there's some comment cards in the back, correct? You could fill them out there and bring them up here. And also, we've asked a number of stakeholders to present in future meetings. But if you do have any ideas or thoughts on this, we do want to hear from the public. There's some public comment cards at the back. Mr. Bonin, any questions?
Just a couple, thank you. Your presentation was very exhaustive. It covered most of what I was wondering about. Just a couple quick ones. Our numbers of unsheltered are up. as you talked about, 70% of our homeless in this continuum are unsheltered.
That's correct.
How does that compare with other continuums? Whether
It's much higher than most continuums. So on average, the numbers would be the reverse. So, roughly a third unsheltered, and, two-thirds sheltered.
So
some jurisdictions have, shelter mandates, particularly northeast, colder regions
Right.
would have that kind of mandate.
So we probably have one of the higher, if not the highest, percentage of unsheltered in our continuum.
It's not the highest, but of major continuum, of large scale, oh, yes.
Okay. Because that's definitely something I want to focus on
Yes.
as we work through this committee is how to reverse that or how to change that. Do we have any sense of why those numbers are up here in Los Angeles? Are there any, other than the contributing factors you talked about the cost of housing, have there been cuts in services or programs, reductions in the number of resources or options that have contributed to that at all?
So if you look at the sort of the shelter population, it has a few components, and I didn't go into the components that we have some characteristics of that. There is a shift from transitional housing to other permanent housing, and that's actually a shift that we're doing that intentionally. But in terms of a reduction of shelter beds, that is not the case. We actually had a modest increase in shelter beds. The increase on the unsheltered population is an increase in overall homelessness, and the factors that are driving that are the same kinds of things that we're talking about in general, and they're financial, and they are essentially health and behavioral service related. Obviously, there are institutional inflows from a variety of institutions, including the criminal justice system. So there is a strong correlation between criminal justice involvement and economic instability, housing instability, and homelessness.
So when we have a disproportionately large percentage of unsheltered in this continuum, I'm wondering what sort of consequences you see that has. Clearly, there's consequences that we all see, which are number of encampments are up, number of people living on the streets or in cars up. But if there are no options for people other than living on the streets, does that contribute at all to our increase in chronic homelessness or mental illness?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to. The question is, how well are we prioritizing those individuals for access to the resources that we do have? So, one of the efforts of the coordinated entry system is to focus outreach on people who are likely to be in those areas, and to get them connected to permanent supportive housing rapidly. So, the answer is, obviously an overall increase in homelessness is going to drive an overall increase in all those numbers. The better we can prioritize the resources that we have, and the wider we can grow the base of resources that we can address it, the faster we're going to get resources to that population.
One of the ways in which you're deemed chronically homeless is how long you've been homeless, right?
That's correct.
So, to my way of thinking, it seems logical to me that if you're living on a sidewalk, you have less access to services, you have less access to caseworkers, you have less access to help, therefore you're far more likely to wind up being homeless longer and therefore become chronically homeless.
So, clearly we need to get services to people where they are. There's no question about that.
Okay. Final thing is I wanted to just follow up on Mr. Weezar's question about sort of point of origin. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about what questions we ask about that. I know in Hollywood they recently did their own survey that asked, they asked where were you a year ago, and large numbers of them were homeless here, large numbers of them were housed here, and large numbers of them were from out of state. And that sort of matches up with a lot of what I see in at least parts of my district. And I'm wondering what we ask, and if we're going to be asking differently or deeper in the next count that we funded.
So, Grace, do you have the demographic survey instrument with you?
Yeah, I do. I'll send them.
So the two basic questions were, where were you living before becoming homeless? So that question kind of gets to, LA County, other parts of Southern California, other parts of California, out of state, foreign country, and then, other or decline or something like that. The other question is sort of how long have you been in LA County? I don't have the exact phrasing, but I have the instrument, so we could come up with that. But those two questions contribute to an understanding of that. And the LA County question has, born here, 10 years, 8 to 10, all down to a week, a month, So we have a very fine gradation of how long you've been in LA County.
And that was asked during the census, or that's asked through CES?
It is asked through the demographic survey.
Okay. Does CES ask information on that?
Well, that's a great question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head.
All right, just let me know.
We've modified the instrument for the coordinated answer system, and I'm not sure whether we asked that question.
One of the reasons I ask is obviously we want to know what's making people homeless.
Yep.
and where they're coming from. Particularly, if you're reporting that we're getting large numbers of folks who are homeless because they're being released from prison and they have nowhere else to go, then part of what we need to do is identify here what the problems are. Part of what we need to do is understand what some of the roadblocks are to getting someone who's housed, try to fix them.
Yep.
Either create a program, seek state legislative relief to some obscure rule or whatever. But if we're also finding that there's large numbers of folks coming out of prison, then we're learning from that when folks are being released, there's not the proper diversion programs, there's not the proper support programs, and we need to figure out with the county and the state how to shore that up. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fuentes?
Thank you, Mr. Weezer. Let me begin by thanking LASA for the tremendous work that they're doing in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. You, with a lot of partners, are helping us as best as you can, and so I very much appreciate that.
Thank you.
I want to pick up a little bit where Mr. Bonin, I think, was going to in terms of how it is that we change the slope of homelessness. You mentioned in your presentation that people are becoming homeless at a faster rate, and I think you said especially among veterans. Is that correct?
So the veteran data is probably the inflow that we have the most data on because, first off, we've been modeling it more effectively than any other population based in part on national models, but we also, it is the most heavily resourced population right now. So, our ability to look at inflow versus, we know housing placements very, very precisely, and we can look at that inflow when we look census to census.
So, and it seems that we're beginning to have, I think, a lot of important information here. So you've got subpopulation and demographic characteristics. Where is it that we have the most opportunity to slow down the inflows? Because to me it seems that ultimately this is a question of resources to be able to provide the service delivery and the housing that we need. So understanding that we're going to have to attack this from both ends, from that perspective, as well as trying to figure out how to slow down the rate of these inflows, where are the opportunities from your perspective? I like what it is that Mr. Bonin was beginning to, I think, probe a little bit more, is the release from correctional facilities and making sure that we shore up some support there so folks don't get into these situations. But is that sort of primarily the place that we should be focusing our efforts, or where are there other areas?
So I think that there are a few different areas where we could get a lot of leverage, and one of them is with a variety of institutional inflows. And I think that the good news is that there are relatively few individuals with whom we have to work to ensure that we've got good coverage on that. Some of that is correctional, some of that is from the foster system, some of that is from the Department of Defense. Some of that is from our healthcare system. So there are a variety of different institutions that we can connect with and make sure that people are not being discharged to housing instability and to homelessness. I think that we need, essentially there are sort of four different, tranches of resource that we would want to look at. One of them for the folks who are the sickest and the highest acuity would be permanent supportive housing, obviously. Another for folks who have some degree of financial stability, but they're financially challenged right now and need some supportive services would be rapid rehousing. So we have some resources for those two populations, for families and for chronic and for veterans. We don't have much resource for the large majority of individuals. The other tranche would be, a deep affordable unit. So we have some people who need a very minimal sort of, supportive service footprint, but their financial independence is really, really challenged. So they need long-term deep affordability, and that's something on the range of Section 8 level, housing assistance and rental assistance. And then there'd be a whole category of folks for whom prevention, diversion, repatriation to family, a variety of other kinds of outcomes would be appropriate. So, we need a strong prevention and diversion, like reconnecting people to what housing options they had before, reconnecting people to family, reconnecting people to other kinds of things, whether it's shared housing or other resources.
The temptation is to sort of create a loading order of sort of where it is that we slow down the inflows, but I think we have to look at this from a segment perspective as we're designing additional sort of support to our housing trust fund, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it seems that trying to peg down those different tranches is going to be really important for us if we're going to slow down sort of the rate of the inflow. You mentioned, and I don't know if you can answer this because it's not in your continuum of care service, Long Beach, Glendale, Pasadena. You mentioned that they've got a decrease recently in homelessness. Is that because they're achieving outcomes that are positive, or is there a migration? How could you characterize?
They're sending theirs to LA. Is that?
Yes.
I don't know where they're sending them.
I don't think that's the case. I think that they do have effective strategies. They differ quite a bit, and I'm more familiar with Pasadena and Long Beach. They have strong coordination between the various players, and they have they do have some effective strategies. There's definitely lessons to be learned there.
The category of sheltered and unsheltered people, if you had to sort of smooth that with what we do during wet weather months, for example, the Armory in Sylmar, or most recently, Greater Missionary Baptist Church in Pacoima, how effective have we been to sort of move people into a sheltered situation, separate and aside from wet weather months? I mean, it seems to me that as a short, quick shelter solution, we may want to look at the existing ordinance that allows us to essentially bypass some of the zoning CUP processes for wet weather months to actually do that maybe even in high heat months or all year long. Has that been an effective strategy in trying to triage the situations that folks are walking into, separate and aside from the climate?
It is certainly an effective shelter strategy, and it does shelter people during those periods. I mean, obviously there are important trade-offs to be thought through and considered and balanced. So shelter per se is not a housing outcome. It is a temporary hold. So the question is, what's the housing outcome that you're driving toward for that individual? That's a really important thing that we're looking at, and we're trying to figure out how we're driving people through the shelter system out to a permanent housing outcome.
Sure.
The shelter is not inexpensive. So from an individual bed perspective, it's about $7,500 a year, which compares, just a little behind, the rental subsidy that we were just talking about. So it's, you have to kind of think those things through. It is more expensive than a rapid rehousing strategy for an individual, and just behind a sort of permanent supportive housing rental subsidy for an individual. So it's very important to look at.
It's also very expensive, though, sorry to chime in, for the city to have people living on the sidewalks.
Right.
In a number of ways.
I'm not saying that we don't need to house people. Right. We need to house all these people. The question is, do we house folks over sheltering them? I think it's a really important thing for us to talk through and think through. Is that the next best use of the next dollar that we have?
Right, and I think this is where, from a policy perspective, it's really an interesting conversation, because I didn't mean to insinuate that shelter means housing.
Of course not.
But to me, it seems in the example that Mr. Bonin gave about how much more difficult it is to remain, or rather the likelihood that people will remain chronically homeless if they're on the sidewalk versus having the opportunity for some shelter, I think affords us the ability to have a touch of an individual to hopefully sort of begin to triage and investigate
Yes.
what it is that we can do to provide solutions to these people. And so I just wonder out loud, in terms of sort of cost, it might be important or interesting to us colleagues to try to do sort of the accounting of, it might be on par with the subsidized rental unit that we would give somebody, but given all of the other things that are happening around the situation of some of these folks who are in the street, it may be less expensive. But I think the point is welcomed that what is the best and highest use of the next dollar if and when we're able to procure it, because that I think is going to be the difficult part of this conversation.
Yeah.
We may come up with, I think, some interesting medium-term solutions, but we're going to have to figure out how to fund it. But my sense is that if we were able to get folks into temporary shelters, it might give us an ability to be able to move them towards close solutions faster than the folks who don't have any shelter at all. And I'm just wondering if there's any sort of work or information that demonstrates that effect.
Our item number 6, actually, that's where that motion was going, was
Okay.
try to get that breakdown
Got
of
it.
accounting of options.
I appreciate the conversation, and one of the things I wanted to highlight was that our shelter system, we had not revised the structure of the contracts and the way that we had procured shelter for the past 5 years. So we have been renewing those contracts for a while, and they basically provided a 12-hour or 14-hour cot for folks. This last revision, we added some features. One was to connect the shelter to the coordinated entry system so that folks are being assessed and they're being moved to permanent outcomes. Second is that we took some of those beds and converted them to a crisis housing 24-hour reserve bed for people who are being navigated through the coordinated entry system, so that you have some people who are quite sick, and the way that the shelter system works, it's a first come, first serve bed, and folks have to queue up to get access to those beds. And if you can't do that night after night after night, you're not going to get that bed night after night after night. So a person who is being navigated through the process because they're one of the most acute individuals on our list, we could lose them to the street and not be able to find them when their housing unit is ready, and they might lose that housing opportunity at that time. So we set out some beds throughout the city and throughout the continuum so that people who are in that stage of being navigated and they're unsheltered have an opportunity to stay somewhere while they're being navigated through the process. So we are trying to be very intentional about the way that we're reconfiguring the shelter system that we have, that it connects into permanent outcomes for people.
So, and my last question, so I can give my colleagues a chance. So that approach to me makes an awful lot of sense from a systems perspective, but it's very centralized. So how do you deal with the mobility aspects of these folks? Understanding that if they're next in queue and we can't get a hold of them, I mean, how do you sort of normalize that aspect of the coordinated entry system?
Well, so the coordinated entry system has navigators and case managers who are working with with the people. So they have assigned folks. They know their population. They're working with people and navigate them through that process. So it is the responsibility of that navigator to move them through. I mean, that's not a seamless or flawless process, and people do get lost, but the intention is to keep track of folks. One of the reasons we wanted to add those beds is to ensure that, the people who are most likely to not be there when you need to get them into their unit, that we have a place where they can be. And that those beds are, that it's for them, it's welcoming, it's not something that they had to wait, queue up or elbow their way to the front for.
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Cedillo, Mr. Price? Mr. Price?
Again, thank you for the report, very illuminating, and the figures are almost as startling as the reality, seeing people on the streets. Yes. You referenced in your report on page 7 the chronically homeless individuals and suggested that the dramatic increase from 13 to 15 was due to a change in definition.
Some to a change in definition. And I would just say that we're working to tease apart the factors that were part of the change in definition and what would be. I wish I could report to you that I can break that out apples to apples, but I don't have that data right now.
So, but you think that was the primary reason for that increase then? Or
I think it was the primary reason for the increase was that we asked questions that were not being captured. So there was a category of other disabling condition. So chronic homelessness, just to reiterate Councilmember Bonin's point, is a duration of homelessness. So you've been homeless for a long time or many, many times, and you have a disabling condition, and you're homeless right now. So those three things come together. If depending on how you ask the question of disabling condition, you can get different kinds of responses. So there's a question, earlier question of sort of, it always included mental health, substance abuse, HIV/AIDS, and physical disability. But there was always a question about sort of other disabling conditions, and I think a lot of people just didn't answer that question in the affirmative, even though they had other disabling conditions like traumatic brain injury, like post-traumatic stress disorder, like chronic illness, like, for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, or some other chronic ailment that would make them disabled, but they just didn't factor that way in the answer to the question. They didn't factor as chronically homeless based on the answers to the question. So part of it is gathering better information from people by asking the questions, and that's really important. Does it mean that those people weren't out there before? No. It's just that we weren't asking the question in a way that gathered the information that allowed us to classify them as chronically homeless. So I think it's a better number, but it's not directly comparable as a stark increase.
Well, it's certainly in District 9, it appears that African Americans seem to be the largest population. Indeed, citywide, it would appear that African Americans are such a large part of this homeless population. Any thoughts on why that ethnic group stands out so much?
It's a very interesting question, and I think that it relates to poverty. So I think the demographics of poverty, also skew. I think, there are different kinds of answers to that question, and I think that, some of it relates to stress, some of it relates to chronic health disorders. I think there are myriad factors to it, but it also correlates closely to indices of poverty.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any questions, Mr. Cedillo?
Sure.
On this?
Thank you for your report. And thank you for the conversation, Mr. Chair. They gives us a lot to think about in terms of how we prioritize limited resources. So you indicated that in veterans we've remained flat. We've got 7,500 housed. So what elements, what can we extrapolate from that so that we could have the same successes for the rest of the community? What disposition, what resources, what behaviors do we engage in that secured that community in terms of being flat versus the other communities you broke out?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously, flat's not what we need. We need the number to go down to zero, but it also does clearly illustrate that this is a problem that responds to resources. So, resourcing this challenge is effective. We can house people. We need to step up those placement rates, but Los Angeles is housing more veterans more rapidly even than communities that have ended homelessness because their baseline was lower, right? So we, not only on a per capita basis are we more effective, but we started from a very, very much lower position. It is a problem that responds to resources. There's no question about that. We need to build the infrastructure of resources for the remaining populations, but this is one of those areas where resources are effective.
I was interested in, you called people who lived here a year, 90%. The people you talked to have been in LA for a year, you called them Angelinos, 80% Angelinos, 3 years. 70% people who were here had been in LA for 10 years. That leaves 30% out. And so I'm interested to see where the other 30% come from. I have only anecdotally, but only because I spoke to electeds in the past who told me, Long Beach's strategy used to be one-way bus tickets to downtown Los Angeles. I'm just wondering what Long Beach, Pasadena, and Glendale do with respect to homeless populations that are distinct. How are they able to access more resources? And how is it that they get a drop in homelessness while we spike up? they're our neighbors, and so like I said, I have suspicion based on anecdotal response from political leadership in those communities, and then because they are so close, then what is it that they're doing resource-wise, policy-wise, that we could take advantage of and have the same results?
Right. So I would be happy to come back and sort of illustrate differences and so forth. I mean, I really don't want to hold myself out as an expert on what Long Beach and Pasadena are doing, and I think that one of the things that they're doing very effectively is coordinating between all of the various factors. So homelessness is a multifactorial challenge. It requires tight coordination between service delivery, between housing resources, between access points. It involves law enforcement and emergency medical technicians. A lot of coordination. Those kinds of collaborations are easier to pull off in smaller jurisdictions. That's just, generally been true. Our jurisdiction is very, very large and very, very complex. It is a little more challenging for us. It doesn't mean we can't. We certainly need to, but it is a different kind of challenge in a much more cohesive structure. So the city and the continuum of care are one contiguous unit. The housing authority is one contiguous unit. The other kinds of resources that are necessary are single contiguous units. Coordination is much more efficient in that sense.
Okay. Finally, so it seems to me, I have two thoughts on this. One, that one of our priorities has to be protecting all the covenants for people who have low-income housing right now. That to me seems to be one of the challenges, and should jump to the top of our priorities, and we will do that through the Housing Committee. But it seems to me, and I think Mr. Fuentes has outlined a pretty thoughtful perspective here, is how can we amplify shelter today, right? What strategies can we engage in that amplify shelter today? Taking what you said, shelter is not housing, but there seems to be a disposition in the city and the committee that we want to move away from the proliferation on the streets. And how can we amplify housing or shelter today?
So obviously, site acquisition, siting facilities is a challenge on shelter. Rehab of sited facilities is a challenge, and then ongoing operations is a financial burden. And, all of those things need to come together. In the winter shelter program, as we expand over those months, there is an emergency declaration. We do, that bypasses all of the, a variety of different kinds of issues. And so facilities that wouldn't otherwise make it through a process, make it through a process. And we can turn armories. Now, would the armories be shelters forever? That's a different kind of question. Sites would need to be acquired. We wouldn't, that wouldn't, there would have to be a process to do that. And,
So what I hear you saying is that this emergency declaration that because this perplexes people. I know it perplexes me, it perplexes the public in general, is, thankfully on certain days, cold weather, rain, et cetera, we rally together as a community and say that's not acceptable and we're going to bring the resources to at least shelter people. Then I think all of us are in a position today to declare this an emergency and say that we could, construct this type of emergency declaration and then do the types of sacramental work, the type of local work, county work that then enables us to create the shelter today. I mean, so far all I've heard you talk about is that there's a legal challenge on the question of some types of codes, some types of regulations, and that it's an emergency declaration that moves us, enables us to do it during different circumstances. Is that correct?
I mean, those certainly are challenges. Obviously, the question of is that the right use of the next dollar is a really important question as well. But I think,
we got that.
Holding those kinds of determinations apart, it would be a process of acquiring sites and figuring out the financing from it. It's that is not a trivial challenge in and of itself, but I think there's a robust dialogue over is that the next best use of the incremental dollars. I think it's an important question.
Mr. President, thank you. I think that's it for the moment.
Okay, we have follow-up questions for Mr. Price and then Mr. Bonin.
Just a quick question on this shelter issue. I'm kind of wondering, how do we make these shelters more friendly, if you will? I told you I live adjacent to, well, not adjacent, but a block down from the shelter on 38th. I think it was initially a winter shelter. Now it's turning into a year-round shelter. And you got the phenomenon of folks camped out right across the street, right around the corner. So, who refuse to go into the shelter or choose not to go to the shelter. How do we address that? How do we, I think it's got to be more than just having a larger shelter space. I don't think it's the fact that these individuals don't get in line early enough. They're obviously choosing not to go into the shelter. So how do we?
So obviously our shelter capacity doesn't cover the number of people who would want to queue up for it, and the process of getting access to those beds is one of a repetitive activity night after night, and it may be that people choose eventually to forego that if they're able to make it on the street. So I mean the question of making them, I think it's a good point, and we could certainly look at the practices we have to ensure that we are open and inviting, and that the services that are being offered are compassionate and they're welcoming. But the raw footprint is also an important consideration, and that the fact that we don't have the beds for everybody is an important piece.
Mr. Bonin?
Thank you. I appreciate this thread of conversation. I was not trying to be pithy when I said in my opening remarks that we need to declare a state of emergency. I meant it for exactly the reason that we've been talking about, in order to fast forward a lot of the solutions, potentially shelters. I think it's important to note, though, that shelters can be a disaster. I mean, in New York, it has not worked out very well, particularly once they disconnected sheltering in New York from their Section 8 voucher prioritization. It became warehousing, and there's been a lot of problems. If we do things like this in Los Angeles, I think we need to think about how to do it differently. In one of the later items, I think it's item 6, I ask us to sort of tease out what the various options are, from shared housing to permanent housing to different types of shelters. But I think all shelters, one size does not fit all. There's a lot of folks who won't go to a shelter, and sometimes it's because it's crowded, sometimes because it's unpleasant. I have a couple examples of why people won't go to shelters. I was talking with a couple who were living on the streets of Venice a couple weeks ago, and they have lost everything in life. They have found each other as homeless people, and all they have is each other. And if they go to a shelter, they need to be separated, and so they won't go to a shelter. Can we have shelters where couples or co-ed people can go? I have a lot of folks, some of the young people who are living on Venice Beach, who runaways, many of them are escapees from bad foster care or sexual abuse, or for whatever reason they're there. They have dogs, and our shelters won't accept animals, so they won't separate themselves from their constant companion. Can we have shelters where people can bring dogs? Not everybody, the young folks I talk to, they're not comfortable being in a shelter where older, chronically homeless folks are. They'd be more comfortable in sort of a youth-only environment. We had a separate section of the West Side shelter about 3 years ago for TAY, for transition-aged youth, to try to sort of entice them into coming in. There's different types of shelters, and I don't think if we think of shelters that we should be thinking of a one-size-fits-all sort of warehousing thing. I think we need to, just as Mr. Cedillo said, there are so many different types of stories, so many different types of people who are forced to live on the streets. Just as we sort of triage them through CES, if there's going to be a shelter system, we have to, there has to be sort of a matchmaking system of some sort. It's harder. It's much more expensive, I'm sure, but it means that it's not the sort of failed warehousing approach that won't work for a lot of people or that will keep so many on the street. So I just want to sort of toss that into the mix as we go forward and think about this as an option.
I understand. I really appreciate your points. And the dog, we have an emergency response team. They do outreach to people, and people are very, they're very unwilling to part with their animals. Several of our ERT folks end up pet sitting for folks who go into shelter. Path Shelter does have a pet facility, but I think it's an important point, and the youth, all these are important points.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and for your continuous work. We hope to continue to have LASA engaged in this committee as we have other agenda items that deal with our coordination with the county, service providers, and what other types of funding there is available for us to address this issue. And we hope to stay engaged with LASA.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
And on this item, we have 4 public speakers. Have 1 minute each on public speaking, and then we will go to the next item. I will call you. There's 4 speakers up, so I could call you all up at one time. Herman, Wayne from Encino, General Jeff, and Natalie Barrett. Why don't we start with Herman? You have 1 minute, sir.
Thank you. Glad that you could have that Snickers there and share your nuts. 1 minute. But anyways, as you heard this long, boring 1 hour and 45-minute conversation, the first problem was I could not find a home to live in, let alone the so-called racism of the city by its gentrification is the cause of all this homelessness. When Weezer was building downtown Broadway, the investment with all his nonprofit padding his wallet, his campaign donors, is the cause of homelessness. When you were kicking them into different communities and busing them in taxis and so forth. So don't shy away from the real problem. The ignorance falls on the incompetence of you creating the problem. Now you have to solve the problem. This report is nonsense. Keep your 2 seconds.
Wayne from Encino.
Yes, crummy report. And also the city attorney failed to mention that the presentation completely went off the topic, which was presentation of a homeless count result. You talked about everything except the Gettysburg Address and the Treaty of 1783 ending the United States versus Britain in the Civil War. The problem with all of this is you have no plan. You have surveys, you know it's getting worse, but you really don't have a plan to really attack the problem. Now, before we got here today, they had the Cultural Heritage Commission regular meeting today, and they brought up actually the issue of homelessness, and one of the items in CD 14, Monterey Trailer Park. Rent controlled at $178 a month. So start with the rent control ordinance as a clue to your problem.
General, want to go first?
Ladies first.
Thank you.
Natalie Barrett.
Thank you. I just wanted to address the points brought up about the decrease in homelessness in the Glendale area specifically, where I'm from, Glendale Adventist Hospital, and I'm the lead for the homeless patients. Sorry. I could tell you that during that count, we were underrepresented. And since we've been keeping track of our homeless patients since October to current, we've seen over 500 patients that's been through our ER and also admitted. And of course, maybe 10 to 15% are readmits. In terms of being a homogeneous population that we have in Glendale, we don't. We see a variety of patients. We see a lot of people coming in from outside Glendale area because of word of mouth that we do help our homeless patients. We have put in better policies and procedures, obviously, where we identify them immediately from the ER.
Just finish up your thought if you could.
Yeah, so we identify them better, and we do have resources where we refer them out for medical and different, boarding care, assisted living, full service partnership, mental health services. We do shelters as our last resort, and we have a partnership with Union Station for 3 beds, where we could also refer patients. So we are tightening up our strategies on that sense, but we do have a lot of homeless patients. So I just wanted to let you know that.
Great. Thank you very much. General Jeff?
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is General Jeff. I represent Skid Row residents. Before we anoint LASA as the deity of all things homeless, we have to understand that there's a lot of expectation on this committee. And just as this committee chair said that, this is just a base. But understand that the homeless count is severely flawed for numerous reasons. But in less than 30 seconds, I can't give them all to you. But one, for instance, is while they talk about the street count, the shelter count, and the youth count, what they fail to include is the jails and the prisons. There's a lot of impact of, and when you talk about AB 109, Prop 47, we got people going in and out of jail, LAPD with their homeless, with their Safer Cities Initiative campaigns, and so they don't factor in, but they have a big impact on the resources. Also, too, when they talk about home for good, continuum of care, those are flawed systems as well, and this committee has to do a better job of analyzing the partners before they select them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, let's go to item number 2, and if staff could read that into the record, please.
Mr. Chair, excuse me, would you like to make an action on this item?
Oh, yes. We can note and file item number 1, please. Thank you. Welcome.
Item number 2, City Administrative Officer report relative to the city's engagement with the homelessness and the budgetary impact to the city.
Excuse me.
Thank you, and welcome.
Hi, welcome. Madeline Rackley with the CAO. I send greetings from Miguel Santana, who is traveling on business. If he were here, he would be able to present his really deep sense of passion about homelessness, and he would tell you about his history managing a homeless shelter and that experience and how that has formed his interest in resolving homelessness. So it falls to me. I am responsible today for carrying the message of that passion and the interest on the part of the CAO and the city to address homelessness. And it starts with this report. In April of this year, the CAO released a report called Homelessness in the City of Los Angeles. At that time, based on the 2013 homeless count, we estimated there were about 23,000 homeless individuals on the street at any given time. As we have just heard from Mr. Lin, based on the 2015 point-in-time count, that number has increased to almost 27,000 individuals. Over the last year, most of the council members have presented motions requesting a more thoughtful and tangible response to homelessness. As a result of these motions and as at a request from the Housing Committee, the CAO undertook a study to review how the city engages with the homeless. And what that meant was how city employees actually interact with the homeless in the course of their work as city employees. We had not done a study about that before, and we wanted to find out what the budgetary impact to the city was of those interactions. The study documents instances where city departments interact with the homeless or where the impacts of homelessness. In addition, the report identifies where possible the costs associated with those interactions. And finally, the study included recommendations about how to move forward. That study and the recommendations were adopted by council in April and then has been forwarded to this committee. The way the data in the report was collected was through a series of interviews between October 2014 and January 2015. My office interviewed representatives from city departments, from LASA, whom you've just heard from, and the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles, HACLA. I must note that a lot of the in-depth research on this was performed by a colleague of mine named Nithya Raman, who's not able to be with us here today, and she did an amazing job collecting this information. We asked the departments when we visited them 3 questions. Where did they interact with the homeless or the effects of homelessness in their work? How do they track these interactions, and how much did these interactions cost the departments? We found that at least 15 departments in the city interact with homelessness and the effects of homelessness, and 4 observations or themes emerged. First, a larger number of departments interact with the homeless than we thought. Second, the city does not appear to have a consistent process for city employees to address homelessness. Furthermore, departments are not prepared to address homelessness systematically by connecting the homeless to assessment or services or housing. Third, the study revealed that the activities and expenditures related to homelessness are not being tracked consistently, although it does seem to be getting better in some departments. Fourth, many departments we found rely on the LAHSA emergency response team to address issues related to homelessness. At the time our report was released, there were 19 individuals with the LAHSA ERT. Since then, the council and the mayor have adopted the 2015-16 budget, which includes funding for 20 additional ERT team members who will provide services to the city, which effectively doubles the number of staff they have. One of the most quoted and famous statements from our report has to do with the estimated $100 million that the city spends related to homelessness. I would like to point out that some of those costs actually support services to the homeless, such as job training and employment services, social services and supportive services, emergency and transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, the ERT staff, support for the coordinated entry system, and other programs that are actually already providing services for the homeless. The report recommends the development of a policy that states the city's goals regarding homelessness. And council members, you've already spoken about that this morning or this afternoon. To prepare such a policy, to develop that policy, the CAO has already begun gathering baseline data so that we have the information, factual information we need to develop a policy for the city. For example, we're collecting information about the universe of housing that is actually available in the region for the homeless so that we can understand what is available to us now. We will take a deep look at the demographics that have been presented to you today from LAHSA so that we can see what kind of solutions, where we need to target our solutions. We are also taking a look at the coordinated entry system, which we call CES, to be able to understand how that works in our city and how we can fund it and how we can take advantage of that resource and make it successful. We are also taking a look at the emergency response team, and we will be working with LAHSA and the county to understand what all the outreach services there are available right now. So we are putting together that data that will be a basis for the city to proceed on developing a policy for the city on homelessness. Shortly, we will also be working with the departments to determine better how to track and measure the costs related to homelessness. Right now, departments, as I mentioned before, don't have a consistent way of tracking that, and there's some reasons for that, but I think we can work through that. That is a summary of the CAO report. I'm here to answer any questions you may have. in the end, one of the things that we will also be able to do when we have a policy and we've looked at this data is to develop the resources that are needed, as the council members have mentioned, to achieve the goal. And until we know what the goal is, we don't know exactly how much it will cost or what the resources will be. So if I can go, off script here just a minute too, I hope we really have an opportunity at this point in time to do something about homelessness, and the CAO is really looking forward to partnering with you to figure out what our future is with homelessness, and hope to be able to do that with you successfully. I would also like to mention that we are working really collaboratively with LASA and HACLA and the nonprofits who work in this arena, and want to make sure that we understand that we get a solution that is actually integrated and works together. We are also interested in hearing from the nonprofits who provide services to the homeless community, so they can be a part of this process as well. So I hope that is a good summary, and I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for providing this report. I think this report really opened our eyes, not only here in the city, but the publicity it got opened up everyone's eyes about the state of the approach by the city in dealing with homelessness. And I understand that some of the items that have gotten more attention was the $100 million. Majority of that goes to law enforcement or other incidental contact with homeless at our libraries, et cetera, but it doesn't account for perhaps more than $100 million that go to housing or other supportive programs, correct? Is that accurate? There was, you counted for about $100 million that go to law enforcement, majority law enforcement, and some other incidental contact with homeless, as our departments contact homeless individuals or provide services for them, but that doesn't account for whatever money we put into housing or support programs that organizations are doing out there already, correct?
This was the best attempt we could make at the time to understand the costs and how much we spend on homelessness. It certainly does not include everything. It just couldn't. We were time limited in a certain way, but I think we can, over time, develop a better way to identify how much we're actually spending. And yes, there are grants and things that were not included in this because they're not exactly money that the city spends. They're outside the city budget. Okay. But we really want the opportunity to understand better how much it costs to interact with the homeless and to deliver services.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you captured in terms of what the city spends on homelessness was incidental costs after the fact for not providing sufficient services up front. And we're having to deal with the aftermath in terms of emergency services and first responders that go out with homeless because we're not investing probably even less than we would have to invest at the front end, providing sufficient housing, support services, et cetera. That's the sense I got from this. But what I also liked that I saw in the report is that to be very blunt about how we don't have a comprehensive plan, we don't have a strategic approach. It's something that I soon realized after 2.5 years or so of representing a majority of downtown and representing Skid Row when I started getting more active, and we expanded Operation Healthy Streets. And as we expanded it and not only provided the number of times we clean the streets in Skid Row, but asked the county to join with us and provide social services prior to cleaning up, how for many at the county were surprised that we were even asking to coordinate with them. And one social service provider told me that this is the first time in her 30 years that the city has approached them to provide those types of social services on the street. And it was really eye-opening to me about how basic that had been, but we really hadn't done as much for it, and that the city really hadn't had that type of coordination in the past. So coordinating both internally what our approach for homelessness and providing the governance infrastructure is something we will entertain later in our meetings here. But I think that is going to be a very important topic for us as we move forward into what is the governance infrastructure that we create for ourselves in the city internally, so that then we could have a unified approach, know where the dollars are coming and going, and also how do we work and coordinate with outside agencies and the county in particular, who provides a majority of the social service dollars. So thank you for the report. And any questions, comments? Mr. Bonin and then Mr. Fuentes.
First of all, thank you to you and your office for this report. Thank you to Miguel. I know he feels very deeply about this issue.
Yes.
He and I have talked about it extensively, but he's not here, so thank you for the work you've been doing on this. I have watched you work extremely hard over this for a number of months, and I'm very grateful for the work you've done. One thing about this report that has been the report and the oft-quoted $100 million figure has, I think, has raised expectations about how easy it will be for the city to re-engineer a policy and fund it. It has created the perception that there is a budget wand we can wave, and we can simply reprogram $100 million for permanent supportive housing or whatever our strategy is. And I'd like your thoughts on what of that $100 million is money that can be reprogrammed, or money that is locked in because it's money that sanitation is paying anyway for sanitation staffers, or that we're paying because the police officers are on the payroll, and if they weren't responding to this call, they would be waiting to respond to a burglary call or something like that.
Oh, gosh. I'm not sure I can answer that today, but that will be part of what we do in the next very short bit of time. We do want to answer that question. If I answer today, I will probably be killed by the departments. So
I thought that. I wanted to get that on the record as a...
I will be killed.
I wanted to get that on the record as a question of what I'm seeking back, because that's fundamental.
That will be part of our analysis about the money.
Another thing I wanted to ask about is, we all would love to be able to reprogram some of this money. Some of it we probably can't. But then we need to ask ourselves, is there money we just need to spend from the general fund, from somewhere else, that is a smart investment to reduce these expenditures 5 or 10 years down the road?
Right.
An example is something the county's doing. The county used some of their boomerang funds, I think, that went into their general fund, and they used it to try to help house people and simultaneously reduce their medical costs. Their flexible housing subsidy pool. They take general fund money, they put it into this, and if you're a frequent user of one of the county urgent medical care clinics, you get a voucher, which is different than Section 8 or VASH. It's funded through this, and you get rapidly rehoused. It was a smart investment, and it's beginning to pay off. Doesn't work for me on the west side because the county doesn't have a medical clinic there. I'm wondering if your office has thought yet, or if as part of the subsequent report, your office is beginning to think about ways we can make investments like that. For instance, in Venice, Fire Station 63, I'm told 70% of the calls that they get are urgent care for someone who's living on the streets who's in distress. If we're spending that money, wouldn't it be so much better to do sort of what the county is doing? So is your office thinking about opportunities like that?
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask is, when you do the subsequent report back, if you can report back on that kind of stuff, also the other question I asked, but well, specifically, a specific breakdown of funds that could potentially be reprogrammed for homelessness outreach services. A list of some high-cost expenditures that can't be reprogrammed, like Fire Station 63, but could possibly be reduced in the future by additional investments. Sure. So that's how I wanted to phrase it. The other thing is, we have, I don't think whenever you're addressing a problem and you're trying to come up with a solution, you do some resource mapping. What are the resources we have? And we've done part of that through this analysis. What I don't think we have a good sense of yet, and I think it's sort of an overlay to the expenditure analysis you did, is what services are there in our city now? I think we can get that information easily from LASA, from the service provider areas, from the county, from the individual council offices. You know, in my district, I've hired PATH to do some work in Venice. My Westchester Neighborhood Council has hired PATH to do some work. Residents in Pacific Palisades are going to hire OPCC to do some work. In San Pedro, Mr. Buscaino has hired LASA to do some work. I'm wondering if we could put together sort of a services and resource map of what's out there in the city of LA now, in the various districts, so that it's those things I listed, but it's also the existing members of the coordinated entry system, so that, you know, we can look at CD11 in Venice. St. Joseph Center does this. New Directions does this. Supplemental stuff from the council office, the community here, and we have a better sense of what the current resources are that match with some of those stuff.
No, that's brilliant. We will add that to our list of data gathering. That's
Thank you.
fabulous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Fuentes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to come back to something that Mr. Bonin touched on in terms of the $100 million. I think it's really important to understand that the way I read this report, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this deals with, the $100 million deals with the interaction with homeless. It's not as if the city of Los Angeles has $100 million that is addressing homelessness. This happens to be the touches that city staff, city personnel have with interacting with the homeless. Is that correct?
So,
and there's the loss of funding, and there's some
Right.
permanent supportive.
Right.
But to me, the breakout of all of that is going to be very important, because interaction, I think, is significantly different than the appropriation of dollars to deal with homelessness.
yes, that you're correct. The surprising outcome of this report was finding that so much money was being expended in the city through interactions with the homeless or the impacts of homelessness. These are generally not appropriations that are in the budget identified to be spent for homelessness. They are the result of sanitation workers running across an encampment and cleaning it up. It's the librarians, you know, interacting with the homeless in the libraries. It's those costs, and we don't have a way of tracking that very well right now, and I'm not sure, again, I will be killed, I'm not sure that you can simply reprogram those funds, because the librarians will continue to interact with people who are in the libraries. So, but what we want to do is figure out a better way to track those costs and have some expectations about that. And maybe there's a budget for homelessness that includes those interactions. Somehow, we're going to figure this out together, and I think we have some real opportunities, again, to understand what that $100 million is for.
I think that's really important, because even I made the mistake initially, as I understood this report, to think that there was an opportunity to reappropriate the dollars to be more effective. But for the interaction, it's my sense that a lot of this would be appropriated the way it's been. So I don't know how much flexibility there is, but if there is some, I think we're desperate to understand it. The other thing that I took away from the report that I think is, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, low-hanging fruit, is this idea that we could in some way train personnel to be able to interact with them in a way where we can maybe steer them into the coordinated entry system. I understand that is a very complicated technical thing, that there are specialists that do that, but if we are touching these people and interacting with them, you allude to it in the report, maybe there's a way for us to, as an example for the librarians at each of the facilities that I hear in my district constantly are interacting with homeless, figuring out a way to get them to be able to do something other than call 911, I think would be a very, very effective thing, potentially. You mentioned it in the report. Is there any work being done to come up with that policy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Councilmember. We are working with LASA and will be shortly with the county, we just started this, to figure out a better way of training city employees in outreach so that there is a consistent response. So if I, as a city employee, encounter someone who is homeless, I know what to do. And it wouldn't be that I would become trained in an intervention, but I would know who to call, and we would have expectations from the organization that we are calling of a certain response. And so we're going to figure that out. That will be part of the change in the way the city addresses homelessness. That will be, I think, a part of the long-term policy. But that means city employees will have training about what to do and who to call and what the expectation is when they make that call.
And I appreciate the desire for having a department that coordinates the approach, but it seems to me that this is one that we could move on, should move on quickly, and try to figure out how it is that we deal with the MOUs or whatever it is the hurdles may or may not be to implement such a strategy. So
we can do that.
I would hope, Mr. Chair, that we get a report back on that, or if we need to substantiate that with a motion, I'd be happy to help with that. Thank you for the report. I'm excited about the sort of medium and long-term ideas, but I'm immediately interested in some of the lower hanging right now. We got to do it all, but the right now sort of solutions, and you've presented a couple here, so I do appreciate it. Our best to Mr. Santana and you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions, comments?
Just in addition to that, if you could dial down on some state changes. Today, the state is moving out of a recession. I think within the last year or two or three, we've moved from like 10th to the 9th to 8th to we're the 7th largest economy of the world. We have a robust surplus, and it seems like the state's poised to help its most important city in terms of some of these problems, healthcare and the enrollment of healthcare. I saw Ms. Schwartz here a little bit earlier. Ruth taught me that many homeless families were homeless because of traumatic experiences with healthcare. Right? Somebody gets a disease, somebody gets a circumstance, they lose their health insurance through losing their job, and then a family is in the car and then on the streets. We have the ACA now, we have a changed circumstance in the state. Let's look at some of the changes that we can do with the state with respect to health care. There was a time period when the state didn't have money that we looked at foster care. Right now we release young men and women at 18, not prepared, not welcomed, and not prepared. We could move that to age 21. We can move that at age 21 with an option for the youth to make that decision. And that would impact significantly more than half the youth who are on the streets. That would play a major role in that. There's other state changes, and I think we need to look down on that. Back to the $100 million, librarians are trained to be librarians, and as I said earlier, members of the LAPD are trained to be police officers, and all the departments that we have here have taken their careers to engage in those activities, and now we want to augment their training so that they can deal with the homeless. Another thought is to look, as it's been stated twice but deserves, us reprogramming dollars. The fact of the matter is that we are spending $100 million, and we are making choices. And we're making choices to spend 85% of that in law enforcement. Are there other people who could be in our employ who could address these matters specifically, right? Where we cite them is where we cite them, whether it's in an emergency room so that we capture there, since it seems to be such a preponderance and significant number there. Do we cite them at the county jail as people come out? Do we cite them at institutions where people are incarcerated and cite them there as people come out, so that we make a transition there into a place other than Skid Row, or into a place where they become homeless? But we should think about training and hiring those people with that expertise, rather than trying to augment and change the duties of our people in law enforcement, or our librarians, or our park directors, and et cetera, those people who come to the city to provide certain services but didn't envision that this was going to be their primary challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Price?
Again, thank you for the report. It is encouraging to know that the city departments now at least recognize there's a need to work in a more collaborative way on these issues. Talk a minute about the Safe Cities initiatives in Skid Row. I know there's been some mixed reviews there, but how do we take the successes that we've experienced there and relate those to other communities, surrounding communities that are in real need, like the 9th District, for example? How can we transfer some of the successful programs, successful initiatives into other areas around the city?
Thank you. I think I would like to ask the police department if they could come and talk about that. I'm not sure there's a representative here today, but I did speak with the police department on the SMART and CAMP programs as well as Safer Cities, and I am certain that they would like to come and talk with the committee about how they can expand that program.
Mr. Chair, maybe we can have a formal briefing on that. Oh, great.
Oh, we have people. Excellent.
Awesome. That was quick.
Good afternoon. The overflow room is a little cooler. Or just over there. Okay. Good afternoon, council members. I'm Commander Bob Arcos. I'm the Assistant Commanding Officer of Operations Central Bureau, and a part of my task in being the commander in Central Bureau is I'm also the Department Homeless Coordinator. With me to my left is Lieutenant Andy Mathis. He is the officer in charge of Safer Cities Initiative, and he'll speak to Councilmember Price's question.
Sir. The question was just kind of review for us what the successes and challenges of that program have been and how we can apply the successes to other parts of the city.
Actually, we think that the part of the Safer Cities Initiative is the cross-training of police officers to on several of the other components of city government. Police officers that are assigned to Safer Cities undergo some specialized training in mental illness, and as well as learning about the other resources within our city family. And these officers are in a better position to go and make these decisions from the field and be able to get the folks who need the services to be able to direct them accordingly.
How many officers are involved in this program now?
There's currently a little over 50 officers, and then supervision as well.
And they're assigned to that because they want to be, or they're assigned to that because that's their assignment?
It's their assignment, but generally speaking, it's a fairly sought-after assignment based on the caliber of the officer that's going there. They're getting an opportunity to get some specialized training, and it's a good job for an officer to come.
And so how does that specialized training, though, translate into services for the homeless?
Well, an officer typically will conduct patrols and will be in a situation where some of the specialized training is the recognition of individuals who are in crisis, as well as some of the other dynamics about substance abuse, chronic homelessness, and maybe we talked about the aspect of returning veterans. Part of the Safer Cities core information they'll get is the recognition of folks in crisis, and apply intervention techniques, including solid communication skills and situations to de-escalate the situations that are, and get them the appropriate mental intervention and or emergency medical care, placements into referrals into programs, various programs that we have throughout the city, and through our partners that we've established, LA County Probation, LASA, Parole, County Health, Department of Mental Health from the county as well.
So you see this as a pilot effort that could be rolled out citywide, or is it just something particular in Skid Row?
Councilman Hush, it's a program that could work in a lot of areas, but it's particularly effective in a population-dense environment. 50 officers, although it sounds like a huge amount, is actually quite diminutive when you space it over a seven-day coverage. Typically speaking, Safer Cities officers will be deployed in Central Division 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we strive to try and get 4 units and the appropriate level of supervision on the streets for those hours.
Well, obviously we need more services, and I'm not saying we need more police services, but we certainly need more comprehensive services. And I think it helps when our officers have have some cross training, so that they're able to provide and be a real resource while they're in the field.
Well, Councilman, we go out and the work that we've done is in collaboration with our partners. It's not just the police department. We have a weekly walk where we go out with the folks from County Health, and we'll send our officers in uniform to go out with clinicians as well as medical doctors to go ahead and to walk the streets of Skid Row. And it's done not with the motivation of crime prevention as much as it is an outreach to go and find the most downtrodden in our society and bring them to appropriate level of service.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, I know this has been targeted primarily in Skid Row, so it has been effective there. But I think this is the kind of program that needs to roll out in other parts of the city, especially where we have chronic issues of homelessness and need all the help we can get.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Mr. Bonin?
Just to follow up on Mr. Price's point, which I agree with completely, in the budget for the fiscal year beginning July 1, we've secured for LAPD the ability to do 3 more classes for training in mental health protocols for officers. Also, during last year's budget process, Chief Beck made a commitment to us on the record that he would create as many SMART teams and deploy officers for them as we, as elected officials, could get the county to provide matched, paired mental service professionals for. Since then, we've been meeting with the Assistance of Supervisor Kuehl's office and Chief Passenger with LAPD and County Mental Health, and conversations are ongoing, but mental health is going to be stepping up, so we'll have the ability to have more SMART teams, not just downtown, but throughout the rest of our districts as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that presentation. And colleagues, if it's with your concurrence, what I'd like to do with this report, we're going to go to public comment right now, but we could I'd recommend that we continue this item for 90 days in the committee and instruct the CAO and the CLA to further research some of the questions that have been raised today, and also any other additional items that the committee members may want to raise to the CAO and CLA. And hopefully in 90 days when we come back, we could have some type of discussion and draft. If we could use this as a framework for our strategic plan, because I think you make a number of recommendations in the report that we could use to start developing our strategic comprehensive plan. And so that we could, if you could explore those recommendations in your own report, see how we could now reshape them into actual policy action-oriented items so that we could then use as our basis for our strategic plan, if that could be the direction, and be back in 90 days to see what that's shaping up to be.
Mr. Chair, if one thing that I'd like to see in the report, if it's okay, if it with you and the committee, is that, as we're drilling down on sort of what dollars are already budgeted and appropriated, that distinction, I think, was heard loud and clear. But I think what we didn't talk about an awful lot is sort of the governance related to those dollars, because I think part of the opportunity here is if there is flexibility in those dollars, it may not be just the Los Angeles City Council that has sort of the absolute governance over those dollars. There might be within us the commission system, our partnership with the county. To me, the governance of those dollars also is one of the things that's tying their flexibility, and to me, the state fixes, that's where that could play into possible legislation at the state level.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I'd also add because I concur with my colleague, state, HUD,
Right.
other groups.
All the governance.
Right. But in addition, there's a recommendation two from the CAO's report, and if they could flesh that out more, this discussion recommendation 2 about having someone in charge to do this, right? A designated person or department to address this, because I know we're the policy body, but we can't manage this by committee. This, at some point, we need to designate and make commitments of resources to a department or an individual who will be responsible for this, to be held accountable for this.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, Mr. City, as somebody in the city that is thinking about this every day, that has the authority and the accountability to direct and coordinate within the city and internally and externally. We could further develop that as well. That'll be an ongoing discussion. My office, along with the vice chair and the members of this committee, will be available to the CAO and CLA to guide those discussions in the interim as well. If there's any further questions or refinements, and then we'll be back here in 90 days to further look at taking those recommendations, turning them into some policy action-oriented items that we could take up as our comprehensive strategic plan.
Thank you.
That we hope to adopt in 6 months. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, officers. Public comment, 1 minute each. I'll call 4 people at a time, please. If you could come up, 4 at a time. Herman, Wayne, Sean, James, Sean has no last name either. James Porter.
Mr. Chair, is that a cumulative total 1 minute for every item?
1 minute for every item, yes, sir.
James?
Herman.
Well, you all heard it. There's no plan. No plan. No plan. So stick the budget, stuff it, and put it where the sun don't shine, as John Walsh, Hollywood Highland, would always say. John's a great educator, a builder of life. To tear down the deterrent of this panel of ad hocs for homelessness. $100 million and you can't come up with a solution? Rather become the problem. The same problem everyone here is pointing a finger right back at you fourfold. Like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But yet, Mr. Fuentes from the Valley don't care. He's too busy on his iPad playing games.
I need to review that later.
The real solution? Come up with a plan. Give us answers. Provide us housing. Provide us jobs. Eric Garcetti.
Thank you. Wayne?
Yes, the best way to describe what's going on here is a term of art that my uncle likes to use, pseudo-intellectualism, which simply means that we have a group of people here that attempt to look like they're intelligently attacking a situation, but don't know anything about it. But they're attempting to be pseudo-intellectuals. One such example of this is talking about librarians interacting with homeless. And somehow that should be funded with the $100 million for homelessness. Duh. And then you have 85% of $100 million, well, that would be $85 million going to cops to shoot people like Brandon Glenn, who are accused of being homeless, and that leaves $15 million and 3 seconds for me to say, stick it.
Sean?
Yes, right here, Sean Gregory with LA Can. Speaking of raised questions, I'm curious that if after almost 10 years in existence, if the Safer Cities Initiative is such a success, then why does the LAPD need an estimated $87 million more dollars out of the estimated annual $100 million spent on homelessness? And how did Mike Bonin and Curran Price get on this committee when after those said facts, they themselves have voted in favor of ordinances that criminalize the very act of being homeless? I think it's time that this city takes a progressive approach to ending homelessness and not an oppressive approach to increase and sustain it. What? Oh, thank you. That's all I got. Thank you.
James Porter?
My name is James Porter. I'm a member of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, known as LA Can. LA Can has worked for years to preserve and increase affordable housing in Los Angeles, as well protect the civil rights of homeless residents until everyone in need of a home has one. This committee could also be governing a panel of community experts who experience homelessness themselves that could offer a solution. How are you going to understand homeless if you don't put yourself in their place? And for you to figure this out, think like a homeless. First, what they feel. If you can feel them, then you can find solution. The committee could also be examining the full city budget and how much money is being allocated to housing versus the documented need in the city housing element. I got a few minutes.
Just finish your next thought sentence,
Yeah,
please, so we can...
Okay. Lastly, the city could be looking at LAPD activity, which already takes up over 50% of the city general fund and contributes to extended homeless, for many due to high volume of arrests, citation. They're also responsible for the recent death or murder of 2 homeless residents. House keys, not handcuffs. I had to cut it short. So.
We got it, sir. Thank you very much. Order. Wesley Walker, General Jeff, Reverend Andy Bales, and Jason Robson. Wesley Walker? Wesley Walker here?
No, he's not. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I took 2 hours on the first, so
General Jeff?
Thank you. Of the 100 million that the CAO's report established, as high as 87 million goes toward the LAPD, who also have their own budget of almost $1.5 million. Now, we take away, this committee repurposes that $87 million. LAPD will have almost $1.4 billion, and they will still be able to complete their interactions as it was presented specifically by the LAPD Safer Cities initiative just a moment ago. So now, with that $87 million, more of that funding can go towards Operation Healthy Streets, which therefore could provide more cleanups. With more cleanups, that means the tents and encampments will still move on a more continuous basis, and then there's no need to rewrite 5611. And then it also frees up other funding to be repurposed. I have more, but that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Reverend Andy Bales, welcome.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your eloquence and for your emphasis on a multi-pronged strategy, and most of all for your heart for people who are experiencing homelessness. I believe you are the right leaders at the right time. Even though this is an epidemic right now, I've never been more encouraged or had more hope that we can turn this around, and that largely rests on what I've heard from you today. And just to give a little open-mindedness toward shelters and housing, for $50 million you can have a permanent supportive housing unit that houses 100 individuals. For that same $50 million you can have 2 union rescue missions that 24-hour a day houses 800 people each, so 1,600 people, and provides the supportive services that's missing in most, absolutely the majority of the permanent supportive housing units. And let's regionalize services throughout LA City and LA County.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jason Robson?
Yeah, Robinson. Thank you, everybody. And in looking at the question of how can an ad hoc committee effectively use the resources to help us end homelessness, your leadership is exactly the right thing at the right time. We need your leadership. We need your leadership in terms of our practices, our resources, our use of resources, our philosophies, and our policies. Philosophically, we need you to end our groupthink, right? We can do this. We have the resources to solve homelessness, and we have to stop thinking about the fact that we can only house these people. We've got to house everybody, and we can house everybody. Okay? We need to look at all of the available resources, people in the faith community, business leaders, residents. when there's an opportunity, people will come together for the solution. This has been demonstrated in Hollywood Forward, Venice Forward. We have people that are available to use the resources they have. On the policy level, we do have to answer tough questions. We've got to look at the interaction in terms of substance abuse, mental health, and our first responders, and the fact that there are people who are in end-stage alcoholism, suffering from liver failure. They're on the street. They're dying. First responders show up, and they refuse medical treatment, and they die on the street. That's a huge cost in terms of human life and the cost to the city. So thanks for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pat Raphael, Jared, East Edge, Ben Noah. Pat Raphael.
Yes, good afternoon, members of the committee. I am here with, as a 420 journalist, here with the group Street Loves. We the people of Venice speaking, or we the people of the world rather, speaking from the streets of Venice. We've been kind of engaged in a bit of tug of war between some of the city workers that are dealing with the bathroom situation in Venice, and we understand the city workers are not the ones making the decision. This is something that is coming from on high. Even though the park is open till midnight, the bathrooms are closed regularly between 8 and 9 o'clock. So I'd say as late as 9 o'clock, the bathrooms are closed. And I feel often there's a marked lack of empathy in the way that people deal with homeless. I mean, you guys are at home. Have you guys gone without using the bathroom from 9 o'clock to 7 a.m. at night? And to have people who are on the streets in this condition, and then here's the term that the council member used, cost after the fact kick in when we come every week and start spraying because, everything is smelling like piss. I feel like too often there's solutions that are right in front of us, and we go the hard route, and then, after the fact, we have to spend money to deal with the problem. So this is what we're dealing with in Venice, and I felt this was a good place to express this.
Thank you. Jared?
Stop criminalizing poverty and homelessness. Stop responding to calls about people pissing on the street or sleeping in the street, until the solutions you're promoting have a chance to take effect. And you'll save a lot of money across many of your departments. This is from the land use laws in the book of Leviticus pertaining to the corners of the fields, guaranteeing the poor and the stranger, the alien, the widow and the orphan, right of way and access to the produce of the field. Chapter 19, verse 9 and 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field. It's called the Peah. The entire tractate of the Mishnah is devoted to the Peah. Neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest that fall on the ground after the gleaners have gathered them. And when you gather in from your vineyards, you shall not take every grape from your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. How about requiring anyone who has an alcohol permit to provide a public bathroom, or a coffee shop to provide a public bathroom? I mean, Starbucks owes me a bathroom by now.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, did you fill out a card? I didn't have you written down. Are you going to speak?
I did fill a card. I gave it to someone.
Oh, okay. You have a minute to speak, and if you don't mind afterwards, if you could fill out a card just for our records, we need to keep those in our records.
Well, I wanted to speak to something that may...
State your name, please. State your name.
Oh, first, my name is Abu Bakr Abdullah.
Yeah.
And I want to speak to something that may increase the homeless population in Atlanta. I myself being a vendor, when I was reading this article yesterday about the City 60 curve vending within, I know it's a lot of people out there on the street that's vending. They are homeless, and they're trying to invest the $221 they get a month from the county to earn some extra money. I mean, that's why they're out there. Some of them are homeless. All of them ain't homeless, but a lot of them are homeless. So I'm saying to the city, if we don't allow these people to sell, I got a license from the city, but why is it that I can't sell on the sidewalk, I'm not doing no harm for nobody. And then another thing, we have a divine right from the Creator to earn a living. I mean, that's a religious right. So in a sense, we're encroaching on the people's religious right to earn a living. And I told the police officer today, man, you make $53,000 a year. That's the starting salary, not including your overtime pay that you get, which may bring you to maybe over $100,000 a year. Why are you harassing me? You know, I may sit down that sidewalk and make $7 or $8, you know? Why are you harassing me? And plus I got a license. Showing the license, still I got to move. Thank you. Is my time up?
Your time is up, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
City Councilman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we will move that, we will hold that item as... No, we got your card already. We found it there. I forgot to tell you. We got your card. Thank you. We will continue that item for 90 days in this committee. Next item, please.
Item number 3, the Housing and Community Investment Department, with input from the Housing Authority and LAHSA, to report on how funding to house the chronically homeless can be directed to make use of the coordinated entry system.
Thank you. I believe we have some individuals from HCID and HACLA here for a presentation, and I think we've also invited Sahira Man from United Way as well. Are you still here as well? Thank you for being here. Zahira is from Home for Good, from United Way, and the Home for Good plan was actually United Way and Home for Good started working on this and recommended this as well, so we want to see how that's working and have some additional information along with LAHSA and their implementation of this. So thank you.
So good afternoon, Councilman. My name is Suzette Flynn. I'm a director at the Housing and Community Investment Department. If we want to go down with introductions.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Carlos Van Natter. I'm director of Section 8 at the Housing Authority, City of Los Angeles.
Okay.
Peter Lynn from LAHSA.
Zahira Mann from United Way of Greater Los Angeles.
So in February and April, we did present oral report backs on this motion, which is on how funding to house the chronically homeless can be directed towards the use of CES. And we did that at the Housing Committee and the full council. So this is really more of a formal written report, and actually it's a little bit of a laundry list of how coordinated entry systems are actually working right now in the city. It discusses the federal mandate that jurisdictions receiving homeless funds, such as Continuum of Care and Emergency Shelter Grant, they are required to have a coordinated entry system. And as we have discussed, the coordinated entry uses a common assessment tool to assess homeless persons and match them for housing and services based on their acuity or their need, high acuity being the highest need. This report also includes a list of the various coordinated entry systems that currently exist and that are operating in the city and county. We have one for single adults. We have a very good one for families who are homeless. There's one being developed for youth. And of course, we have our veterans program. And then we have special populations that we have for people with mental health challenges through County Department of Mental Health. And then there's the County Housing for Health. And both of those last two programs, although they're operated by the county, they house homeless in the city as well. And then the gist of the report is how HACLA, LAHSA, and HCID are currently implementing coordinated entry right now. And I have to say that over the last few months, the three of our agencies and many other in the county, of course the Home for Good has been vibrant in all of this, that we have made significant changes to our program so that we are incorporating coordinated entry into a vast majority of what we do with respect to homeless people. And then finally, it includes recommendations for directing funding to house chronically homeless using the coordinated entry. And these recommendations are made to be considered in light of the fact that there's a lot going on with data collection and assessment to develop the homeless policy. So you've heard a lot. It's been a long afternoon. And I just didn't know if you wanted us to go over things in more detail, if you wanted to just ask us direct questions, or have a chance to read the report, because I think you got it kind of late.
Yes, we got the report yesterday, and but for now that will suffice. And if there's others on that could, any other presentations on this, or maybe Lhasa and United Way might want to chime in on some of the background on CES and the importance of it and to the city.
You've certainly heard a lot from me. I will defer to my colleague.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for providing us with this opportunity to speak before you and for your leadership on this issue. So at United Way, I work on our Home for Good initiative, which was initially launched by United Way of Greater Los Angeles and the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. But it's an initiative that's supported by well over 100 different partners. And really, it's an effort to end homelessness in LA County. With Home for Good, we focus on 4 key strategies: efficient service delivery through the coordinated entry system, sufficient resources through the Funders Collaborative, excellence and quality through the standards of excellence, and then building public and political will through the Business Leaders Task Force and HomeWalk. With these strategies, we've coordinated $440 million in public and private funding. Our partners have housed over 20,000 people, and at HomeWalk, our annual 5K on ending homelessness, we've mobilized 63,000 people. Really, the broad-scale impact of Home for Good is significant, and there are a number of partners that are involved in the work. With the coordinated entry system, again, it started out as an effort with partners. So the effort started, it was first piloted in Skid Row. The coordinated entry system was then designed by those who were actually touching the work. So our service providers who are working on the issues every day, the agencies who are at this table were also critical partners in that, to create a system that feels organic and that addresses the needs of the population. It's a system that addresses the unique needs of an individual by first assessing what that person needs, what are the other resources they have available to them, and then helping them through the process from understanding those needs to then finding the housing that's appropriate and the housing that's available, and then eventually connecting them with housing. So this individualized system also looks at this comprehensive effort of how do you bring someone from street to home as efficiently as possible, and what are the resources that are needed in order to make that happen. After being piloted, it was then expanded to additional communities, and now it's been expanded throughout the entire county. Each region has a system that embraces the unique resources of that region. So the coordinated entry system that exists in SPA 4 is slightly different than what exists in SPA 1. So just to give you a sense of what that is, our county is broken up into 8 different service planning areas. SPA 1 is the Antelope Valley, SPA 4 is Metro LA. Those areas look different, they have different resources, and the coordinated entry system takes that into account. It still has elements that unify the entire system so that we can still look at it as a county-wide system, but understanding that the services that are available in SPA 4 are different than the services that are available in SPA 1. As another element through Home for Good, I mentioned the Home for Good Funders Collaborative, and last year the Home for Good Funders Collaborative decided to make a very strong investment in the coordinated entry system. It's something that we saw flourishing, and we wanted to make sure that we were supporting it. So those group of private and public funders came together to further invest in the system, and it's something that we recently released a request for proposals, and that we're looking at funding again this year. That funding includes funding all of the different service planning areas so that the entire county is covered. With this system, really what it is that we now have the infrastructure in place for comprehensively addressing homelessness, and because of the system, we know what some of the gaps are, what are some additional resources and some additional places to plug in, and how we can all use our resources as efficiently as possible, from here at a local level all the way up to a national level of what are the different resources that can help to support the system and help us end homelessness in LA County. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And it's great to see that the departments have embraced CES and are implementing it And clearly, it's still evolving, and we're modifying it to fit the needs of our clients. But it's a useful tool. We thought it was important to put this out in the forefront of this committee as one of the most useful tools that we have out there right now to start addressing homelessness in a more comprehensive and effective manner. I do have a couple of questions. One is the term that's used to identify first priority for CES is most vulnerable? Is that the term we use? Is that, or how do you, or what do you define as?
The terminology has evolved. I think highest acuity is probably the levels.
What was it?
Acuity of service need. We talk in terms of service needs.
Yeah.
The language is sort of in evolution, but it's highest acuity of service need is sort of where we.
And how do you identify that? What is that? What are the factors to go into that someone would get priority in CES?
It's based on a number of factors. So the assessment tool that's done, which is the VI SPDAT, and hopefully I'll get the acronym right, but it's the Vulnerability Index Service Decision Prioritization Assistance Tool.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Well, they're all
That's
in.
close.
That's okay.
There's my.
I think I might have switched two of them.
Okay.
So with that tool, again, going back to understanding someone's unique needs, we get an understanding of how long have you been on the streets? How many times have you been to the emergency room? What are kind of some other resources that you have? Do you have family? What kind of illnesses do you have? And all of that information helps us understand what their acuity score is. So we look at those who score, looking at it from a scale of 1 to 4, those who are scoring 3s and 4s, those are individuals who are higher acuity, who really would need some level of permanent supportive housing. And so what CES also does is it really helps us target those resources so that we now know that not everyone who is chronically homeless needs permanent supportive housing. Some people might be able to go to rapid rehousing or affordable housing, but that VI SPDAT helps us understand what level of resource someone needs.
Great. And so as we're implementing this in the city, what other ways can we expand it? And I know there's another item on the agenda we're going to discuss as well, but are there any other ways that we could be expanding it within the city and use it as a tool here?
Well, one of the things that we're doing right now, actually, it's part of the consolidated plan action, is we're revamping our home-funded permanent supportive housing projects to use coordinated entry. We had to do it through the consolidated plan because these projects are regulated by the Home Investment Partnership Act, the home funding, and they require either a lottery or a chronological filling of the units. So HUD supports coordinated entry, but we had to go through the con plan to get them to approve that. We did include that in this year's con plan. So we did that really primarily for permanent supportive housing. And so those units, once HUD approves the plan, I'm not sure if they've done that yet, we will begin developing the policies and procedures for all of our new and turnover units in permanent supportive housing to use coordinated entry. One of the systems that are in this report.
And I'd like to piggyback on that the Housing Authority does require that developers and nonprofit partners in our various permanent supportive housing programs use the coordinated entry system for all turnover and new units coming online in the programs. We have over 16,000 units targeting assistance for formerly homeless people, whether that's shelter plus care for people with disabilities or HUD-VASH for veterans. All of those programs are using the coordinated entry system now. And in relation to the earlier point that was made on the CAO report on $100 million being provided for homeless, the Housing Authority provides over $150 million every year for rental assistance directly to formerly homeless individuals through these different 7 permanent supportive housing programs that we have. So that number was not included in the CAO's report, and I just wanted to make a note of that.
One of the most powerful features of the coordinated entry system is that it is a framework for a multiplicity of services that can be slotted in as we start to identify the needs in the population. So, people can present with a need for benefits counseling and be connected to somebody who can actually do that. We can slot in the same kind of resources for workforce development, for other kinds of service needs, and it's a really powerful framework for integrating multiple services based on what the needs are of the individual.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Bonin?
Just a couple. Let me try to translate some of this, actually, because this is so easy to get acronym heavy. It's so easy to sound bureaucratic. This is a big deal. This is a big change in how Los Angeles has done things. The county, the agencies that have done this are a few years ahead of where we're trying to get to today in developing a coordinated strategy. And that's what this is. It's a coordinated strategy and it's a system. And one of the things that is very good about it is agencies talk to each other and work with each other on one hand. And on the other hand, we're sort of literally trying to make a list of everybody who's homeless and sort of prioritize needs and then match make them with the available services. Now, the huge problem with the whole thing is that there aren't enough units, there aren't enough services. The supply and the demand don't match up. But what I've seen happen, and I've tried to watch CES very closely, is that in Venice, for example, if I have someone who is homeless and they are 21 years old, they may, for breakfast or lunch, be at Bread and Roses from the St. Joseph Center. They may, later in the day, on a Thursday afternoon, be at Safe Place for Youth, where they may get a doctor's checkup, or where they may get some job training, or they may get some other services. And they may also, during the course of the week, get approached by an outreach worker from PATH, People Assisting the Homeless. Now, instead of those three agencies treating in silos, they're all talking together. And that's a big, big deal. And I think it's very important for the city of LA to do its best to integrate with this system. It ain't perfect. There's problems with it. But LA is a big voice in the process, and frankly, CES was sort of established in a way that was somewhat murky to the city, and I don't think we felt particularly engaged. But we're there, and I think one of the things we have to do is assess, as this happens, what's good about it, what's bad about it, and use our voice to try to change what's bad or mitigate it so that it better suits, so that it improves, so that it gets even more robust. One of our problems, Mr. Cedillo talked about the need for someone to coordinate, is I don't know that there's anybody in the city who's thinking about how CES works or doesn't work. The agencies do, for sure. That's not to take anything away from the agencies. But in terms of the ground level, how is this actually working on the street? And we need someone who can sort of harness what Mr. Cedillo is hearing, Mr. Fuentes is hearing, what I'm hearing in my district. For instance, the acuity ranking doesn't do me a lot of good for the over representation I have in my district of people who are under 25. Because they're younger and physically healthier, they don't get as high an acuity ranking. Now, I know that that's being worked out and there's trying to be a way to accommodate that, but it's the kind of thing we need to hear from our service providers so we can feedback and reshape. But it's a really, really good program. I know it's so easy to get lost in acronyms and stuff. This is a good thing, and it's important for us to engage right so that we can make it better and make sure it works for our communities.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Price?
Yeah, just one. Again, I appreciate the presentation of all. But you mentioned the role that the spas are playing, each one, and suggested that each one is sort of tailored a little differently depending on resources in that spa or needs in that spa. How would you characterize Spa 6's resources, programs, designed to assist? Where does Spa 6 fall into the level of services that are available?
Well, I think, and I'm sure Peter could speak to this as well, with Spa 6, each, as I mentioned, each spa is a little bit different. And with Spa 6, one of their challenges seems to be a housing resource challenge. And so There are a number of different organizations that are working within SPA 6, and what we've seen over the course of the year, especially through the funding, is that those organizations are working better together today than they have ever before. So the level of coordination and collaboration that they're able to do has really been able to enhance the work that they're doing in SPA 6. So that as we look at what they can do next year, it's only further augmented and increased. But because each spa is different, then we can also look at where are some places where we can help with capacity and where can we help with additional need within that spa. And looking at that region as a unique being really helps us do that. So SPA 6, again, is a community that has one of the highest needs related to our homeless population. So that's something that very much, as we sit around the Funders Collaborative Table, is something that we think of. And as the CES teams are working, it's something that's thought of as well, is how can we help those communities that have fewer resources, and what are some of the supports that can be provided to ensure that our entire county thrives.
Can I continue that?
Thank you. That's my concern as well. How do
Quick direction.
communities, I mean, all of our areas are in need. Some are in greater need. And so how do we shift resources? How do we allocate, reallocate? How do we, leverage resources in a way that makes sense? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, and this was more, we've actually have run this through council already. It was more informational for us as a foundational item for this committee, so we could see what's out there, publicly hear it, inform ourselves as to where we are. So thank you very much, and this item will continue to come up in other reports and agenda items, and particularly with the CAO, and see how we can continue to implement it in other aspects of the city in terms of how it's working with homeless. So thank you very much for your presentation. Colleagues, we are running in overtime, so what we will do is 4, 6, and 7, Mr. Bonin has some direction to staff, and then we will take those items quickly, and we will continue item number 5. And we will continue item number 5 on those. Yeah, we do have public comment on this one, right? Yeah, I haven't done public comment on this. I got that. Yeah, I'm just giving us a head to see where we go from there. So I'll go to public comment right now. Item number 3. We will do 4, 6, and 7 next with Bonin, Councilmember.
Mike is cool.
Mike, with Mike giving us direction, giving staff direction on that, and we'll continue item number 5. So on this item, public comment, Herman, Wayne, Steve Diaz, and General Jeff.
It's a slam dunk. Stark reminder of the city's failure to properly address homelessness. Such a pressing question, no. Cruel and unusual punishment, yes. Why? Well, the 8th Amendment violation that you've created. Where's the decency of fairness for the chronically homeless? As the Rolling Stones would say, then give me shelter. Look at me. Give me shelter, baby. Because you absent-minded people have forgotten about the federal mandate. And I demand that the federal mandate step in and audit the inadequacy of these services to provide homeless shelters? No, but to follow what Susan Stobel versus LA did for people's property that was being taken away from them because they were homeless, chronically homeless. Again, decency and fairness, give me shelter, the Rolling Stones.
Wayne?
Yeah. You're so tired, and so you have to wrap up everything quickly by making 1-minute comments. It's so bad, isn't it, that you have to sit here like little past your nap, past your bedtime, and you don't want to talk about the fiscal impact.
Wayne, can you hold on, please? You got to speak to the item on the agenda. Can you speak to the
little
item on the
babies,
agenda?
I know, little babies. Fiscal impact statement.
He didn't bother to do that because they were too busy playing Candy Crush. Community impact statement, oh, why bother? Nobody cares about the community. So now it's 5 after 5, and now you have to ramrod the rest of the agenda rather than letting the people speak on each item for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's too late.
Steve Diaz, General Jeff. General Jeff.
Good afternoon, committee. General Jeff from Skid Row. Once again, while this is, a foundation establishing meeting, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. And so before we start singing Kumbaya and singing the praises of the coordinated entry system, we have to understand that's just only one solution. Just like Home for Good is flawed, homeless count is flawed, the continuum of care is flawed, all the solutions that are being brought before this committee are flawed. So before this committee actually goes forward with actually embracing and endorsing a solution, let's find one that works. When we talk about CES, again, just like homeless count, they don't include the jails and the prisons. So either they're going to have to expand their current database, or they'll have to create a whole separate database to include the jails and prisons, because there's no funding that's being allocated for these folks. And when they come home, they're out on the streets. And so all it does is it creates a backlog of homelessness instead of actually housing the people.
Thank you. Deborah Lashever? Is that you?
No, I'm Andrea. I think I put the wrong...
Yeah, that's, okay. Did you fill out a card?
Yes, but I put the wrong, I think the top of the
Yeah, we'll find your card in the meantime. What's your name again?
Andrea Theodore.
Okay, we'll find it. Okay, Deborah?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Deborah Shever, and I think the CES system sounds awesome. I really do. I love the coordination with the different entities and stuff like that. The problem is that we're looking at it and at LASA as panaceas, and they're not. CES is a data coordinating system. It cannot make more resources. It cannot make more housing. So it's great. We have the funnel, but we have nothing to funnel people into. That is where we need to spend our money. LASA is being used as the balance, the only balance for the 5611 and for many of the other criminalizing ordinances that you guys are promoting. You're saying, oh, don't worry, because it's totally balanced, because loss is on the other side. Problem is, sorry guys, loss is not doing enough of a job to be able to take care of all the homeless people. So to say that, yay, don't worry, because loss is out there, they're the balance for all these criminalization laws, that doesn't make any sense. There is no balance there. They do not have the resources to balance all these criminalization laws. And to say that they go out there all the time and talk with all the people every time before every sweep, I know the people in Venice. I work with them every day. That is not true. We did a survey, and the people have not seen LASA. They have seen the police every day, but they have not seen any social workers on 3rd Street or on Oceanfront Walk. None. And if you guys think that that is a balance for your criminalization laws, it's not. So you got to stop saying that. That is not true.
Thank you very much. Andrea Theodore?
Hi, I'm a citizen. I want to share my experience in Skid Row. I've done outreach, volunteer groups, and there is a huge problem with big hospitals like USC County Medical Center releasing mentally ill, at-risk individuals to shelters where they are not equipped to be mental health institutions. So the same people end up on the streets, and the LAPD even is frustrated with having to deal with this revolving door of arresting mentally ill people, taking them to the hospital, and then days later, they're back on the street. We need care centers outside of Skid Row for the mentally ill, and we need a safety net for them because they are the most vulnerable, the elderly, at-risk women. They end up in Skid Row, and they're not going to the shelters, or they're using the shelters as a part-time basis, and really, we need mental health institutions for people that are at risk.
Great, thank you very much. We do have in some later meetings, agendas precisely speak about those issues. So on this item, we will wrap it up and note and file this report and adopt the report. It's been previously adopted, so we'll just note and file this item. Thank you. Hold 1 second. Oh, it has. Oh, we're adopting. Do we have to send it to council? Yeah. So let's send this to council and adopt it with a recommendation to adopt the report. Thank you very much. Thank you. So from here, we've done 1, 2, and 3. Item number 4. Mr. Bonin?
Thank you. Colleagues, we've heard a lot today about how it is incumbent upon the cities to start coming up with solutions, to start doing more than criminalizing. We've heard a lot over the past several weeks and months about how there is a huge gap between our supply and demand. And as Ms. LaChevre just talked about, there's nothing at the end of the funnel to put people into. So the next 3 items we have are ways that start to address that. I think one of the things we have to do on this committee is look at what the roadblocks are, what the problems are, and try to find ways to remove them. There ain't going to be no silver bullet. It's going to take dozens and dozens of small actions. In this motion here, what I have asked HCID and Department of City Planning, CLA, and City Attorney to do is to give us a report about how we can take some of the either existing affordable housing or affordable housing that is going to come online in various different ways and see if it can be used for housing vouchers, the coordinated entry system. Right now, we have a lot of affordable units being built in the city of LA through, for instance, SB 1818. That's a state density bonus law. Sometimes when there's developments in our district, we manage to get some of them to add a percentage of affordable housing. A lot of times, these are situations where it's a few units in a market rate building. And the folks who run those market rate buildings have no experience in providing affordable housing. They don't know how to recruit for it. So what this motion does is 2 things. It asks the city attorney and HCID to report back to us on what extent we could require developers to do any of the following. Make units available for placement of individuals by the coordinated entry system or for people holding housing vouchers such as Section 8, VASH, or Shelter Plus Care. I kind of expect they're going to come back and say we don't have that legal ability. So if so, I'd like them to tell us what state or federal remedy we need to seek, what sort of laws we might seek a change for so that maybe the city of LA can do something that other places can't. That's happened before. The other ask is to HCID and planning that in lieu of being able to require units to participate in CES or take vouchers, what can we do to incentivize? If the strategies we could come up with that could incentivize folks to do that, just as a lot of landlords are stepping up now to provide units for veterans, are there ways we can create incentives for folks to be providing their units available to coordinated entry or to other of these voucher programs?
Thank you very much. We will send this motion to full council without objection to have the council fully adopt this and
Right, or we could ask the city attorney and HCID and planning to report back here.
Sure. How many days do you want to give that so we can have a general sense?
I think this one, because it's a legal analysis, probably won't take them a long time. Could we have this back in August?
That is fine.
Okay, so in 30 days, 30 days it's flexible, but
yeah,
45 days?
Sure, 45.
45 days?
Yeah.
We'll continue this item in committee for 45 days. We have some public comment. Tom Grode.
Mr. Cedillo had comment.
Oh, Mr. Cedillo.
Just one
I'm sorry.
thing. I just want to make sure I see that we're asking the city attorney. I want to make sure we're asking all the relevant departments who has an impact on the housing and availability of the housing, whether it's building the safety, whether it's planning, because if we, depending on who you ask, that's the type of response that we're going to get, and we want to make sure we get the whole range of departments that have an impact of all the impediments that exist on creating and utilizing available stuff.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions on this?
Mr. Chair, would you like me to read it into the record?
Yes, please.
That's item number 4, which is a motion, Bon and Wisa, relative to a request to HSID, the Department of Planning, CLA, City Attorney, to report with an analysis of existing opportunities and whether state legislative remedies could be sought for the city to incentivize or require that certain affordable housing units be made available to the coordinated entry systems.
Thank you. Tom Grode, are you here? Tom? Herman, Wayne, General Jeff, Jared, Asaj Ben Noah.
Well, we're looking at an economic, financial empowerment loss arbitrarily without discrimination for those who acquire those resources. The need for programs and service activity is apparent. It shows the lack of city government at a local level, but once again, not the lack of excuse, but many excuses by segregation and the opportunity to social well-being. I came back to LA thinking everybody was afraid of being attacked because you were homeless by the white people, the wealthy white people in Los Angeles nowadays. But I was still going on thinking about homelessness on and at the time, but really prejudice and oppression created by you. Thank you for homelessness.
Wayne?
Yes, we can return to not having to speak in baby voices, but thank you for the two people that aren't paying attention to the meeting. So item 4, community impact statement. Guess what? None submitted. And now we're going to give the greedy, disgusting developers tax credits and density bonuses. Oh, that's going to solve homelessness, isn't it? Oh, that's a great idea. Just what the fuck we need in LA, more density bonuses so we can overdevelop more, so we can squeeze out more people from affordable housing to build multi-unit housing and raise rents. Just what the doctor ordered. We just keep going over and over again, keep making the same goddamn mistakes and expecting a different result. Take the part of the $100 million, invest yourselves in a clinic because you're clinically insane.
General Jeff?
Good afternoon, committee. General Jeff. You know, this is a brilliant motion up until the last three words. You know, I really love what it says. It's well thought out, except, again, it's putting all the eggs in one basket, going to a coordinated entry system. I understand it's a starting point, but please don't sign off on that. There are a lot of flaws with this program. For instance, let me expound on my previous point when we talk about coordinated entry system and its flaws in terms of regards to jail and the prisons, because if it was truly a coordinated entry system, it would help house the folks coming out of the jails and prisons, which would then cut down on the recidivism rates, which would help ease, you know, a lot of the other financial burdens across the city. A big problem I have with coordinated entry system in Skid Row is that when they created this, there were already pre-existing waiting lists for people that desperately need to get off the streets, and they basically told all these folks, even if you're next in line, you got to go to the back of our line and start all the way over. And so there's a lot of disrespect, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people have to suffer through these processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Jared Esaj Ben Noah?
So, poor people have a right to sit or stand or sleep in the public area. There's an entitlement also in a just society, as I showed, for a poor person to be entitled to certain of the property of the landowners. And there's an obligation on the part of landowners to provide obligation to the poor for the landowners in a just society, which we're not, but we can try. We should incentivize and require that if affordable housing units be made available. One way we could do that is by stop incentivizing overdevelopment. In the planning committee meeting, I think on Tuesday, there's a proposal for an interim control ordinance on any further development until affordable housing could be provided, until existing law could be enforced. The Coastal Commission has ruled that we need affordable housing in Venice. The Mellow Act isn't being enforced. Why don't we just enforce existing law and put a moratorium on development until existing law can be enforced? Regarding affordable housing, in a just society, that would be an application of the principle of pay out.
Thank you very much. So we will see that back in 45 days. Item number 5, can you read that into the record, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, going back to number 4, I think a request was made earlier to add building and safety and other departments as appropriate by Mr. Cedillo as well. Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah,
great.
That's,
Item number 6 is a motion.
let's go to 5. We're actually going to refer that to staff as well, but if you can read that into the record.
Very good. Motion Wesson, Bond, and O'Farrell, we said, relative to an instruction to the CLA with the assistance of various city departments and external agencies to report with information regarding policies, public funding, and services targeted toward youth homelessness, including the subpopulation of LGBTQ youth, and recommendations to reduce youth homelessness, and CLA also to report with a plan to hold community town hall meetings to discuss its report and recommendations.
Great. Thank you. We'll also refer this item to staff and to be back in 45 days with that report, the concurrence of the committee. Public comment, Herman Wayne, Janet Denise Kelly, and Gerald Thompson. Is Janet Denise Kelly here or Gerald Thompson? Not here? Okay.
Policies, public funding, and services targeted towards youth in homelessness like myself and many others in the city of Los Angeles. We children deserve more. Youth recommendation to provide homeless housing for us youth. Those of you who are the tyrants, Caligula, all you Caligulas, insane, in vain, making us all homeless because of your glory stand, your grandstand, to say, look what I have accomplished. You're a failure to us kids. And all we want to do is have fun at City Hall and remind you how to do your job. Perform. Take the criticism, Mr. Wesson, little man, Mr. Bonin, Mr. O'Farrell, and you, Mr. Weezer, who says you don't lie and cheat. I'll remind you, you have cheated.
Wayne.
Oh, yes. Well, number 5 is for the LGBTQ, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth. Yes, we have to cater to the LGBTQ on every single thing that comes through City Hall. There's nothing that we can't do with a Mike Bonin interview that does not involve LGBTQ. I've never seen one yet, and I'm glad that you didn't skip item number 5, because the last thing we need to do is not discuss LGBTQ. And isn't it nice that we're going to have more transgender, and they're going to be homeless, and we're going to pay for that and their sexual transition. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will refer this to staff and hear the report back in 45 days in committee. No objections ordered. Next item.
Item number 6, motion Bonin, Weisad, relative to a request to HCID and the city attorney to report regarding the Jones settlement and related issues, and a request to HCID, LASA, the CAO, and other appropriate agencies to report relative to linking the CES to provide the homeless with options such as bridge housing, shared housing, and transitional shelters rather than sleeping on public sidewalks. The committee may recess to closed session.
Councilmember Bonin.
Thank you, colleagues. We discussed this a little bit in our first item. As you know, we've become a city of encampments, increased by 85%, and there will be a time before the end of the year when we will probably be freed from the restrictions of the Jones settlement because we will have met the court's requirements. And the city's then going to have to wrestle with what we're going to do. The courts never said to us that we needed to we needed to allow people to sleep on the sidewalks. They said it was cruel and unusual punishment to forbid people from doing so if we didn't provide enough shelter and housing. And we made I don't think any of us were on the council at the time, made the decision to make sidewalks the default. And I happen to think that that's the wrong choice, and I think it's been wrong for people who are homeless, and I think it's been wrong for our neighborhoods. So this motion speaks to what we were talking about earlier with Peter Lynn on the first item, asking our departments to report back to us with an assessment of what the range of options would be for a humane continuum of housing and shelter options. We spoke a lot about shelter earlier, but I think that also needs to include shared housing, bridge housing, all sorts of options. What I would ask is that we asked the full City Council have a discussion about Jones and what to do when it's over in closed session, full council in August or something, because we may hit Jones by October, so we need to start thinking and engaging. But specifically for staff, I'd like to direct two things that report back to this committee. One is that HCID, CAO, and CLA work with LASA, Home for Good, and service providers to construct a menu of options for things between sidewalks and permanent supportive housing, including estimates of what the cost would be per person for providing a shelter bed, shared housing, permanent supportive housing unit, and the cost of sleeping on the sidewalk. And the second would be to request the CAO, HCID, and LASA report back on what steps it would take to actually create that humane continuum of shelter and housing options in LA. I think some of that might be done in coordination with what CAO is already reporting back on, but it's sort of a separate and bigger item. And it's a conversation we really need to start having. So that would be my motion, is to direct the two things I've read into the record, which I can provide to the clerk, and to request the City Council President schedule a meeting, closed session meeting of the full council on Jones sometime after council recess.
Okay. We could hear this back in committee in 45 days, but you have the request to hear this in full council for closed session. So
maybe send it to council and then have the closed session briefing and then bring it back to committee.
Sure, let's do that. So we'll approve this item as amended by Councilmember Bonin and move it on to council.
Thank you.
Okay. With no objections, that'll be the order. Thank you. Herman, Wayne, Joseph Thomas. Is Joseph Thomas here? No. Ralph Vertig here?
A stark reminder of the city's failure to properly address homelessness in the settlement agreement, violation of the 8th Amendment of the American Disability Act, sleeping on public sidewalks, mandated by the federal government that no person who is disabled shall not be discriminated because he can't sleep, sit, squat, fart on a sidewalk because it ruins your development, because we look crippled and sound so ridiculous, Mr. Fuentes. But I can't cry today because I'm just sad by the cruel and unusual punishment. I thank you, Carol Stovall, for your action against the city. Ms. Jones' settlement should go forward, and I am in the 8th Amendment agreement, and again, I pursue all American Disability Acts in Title I and II for discrimination against people homeless.
Wayne?
Yes. The Jones settlement, you claim that the settlement has served the interests of no one. You should all resign, especially from this committee, because the Jones settlement is one of the most excellent pieces of litigation ever. Because what it does is it shows that you're violating the 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment provision of the Constitution when you turn around and persecute people for not having a home in a corrupt-run city such as this. And the Ninth Circuit told you to build 1,250 units. But you had 7, 8 years now, and you haven't built the units. How the fuck can you not build the units in 8 years? Why? How much money is that? You need to comply. It's a judgment. It's a court order. And you spend 8 years and you still have not complied? Build the 1,250 units already. Jesus. Stop giving the $100 million to the police to shoot people like Brandon Glenn and build the 1,250 fucking units. It's as simple as that. This is not a closed session item.
Thank you, Wayne.
It is a fact.
Thank you, Wayne.
Build the goddamn units.
Thank you, Wayne. Ralph Fertig, and then Luis Babella, General Jeff, and Susan Shannon.
I'd like to address the issue of the overnight parking. Thank you. That you should look at the model that's been set by Santa Barbara by making civic and ecclesiastical lots available. They've done a wonderful job. What you're proposing to do, in the shadows of what I can gather, will be a new parking ordinance, is to isolate those most in need from the services that were initially located in Skid Row, because that was where the people were. But now to prohibit overnight parking in residential areas would cause great dislocation and lack of availability of the poor. Can I say one other thing?
If you could just make it quickly, please.
Los Angeles spent $128.94 per day per prisoner in jail. The average apartment rental as of May 20th of this year, one-bedroom apartment would be $62.90 a day. Two bedrooms would be $83.38 per day. Compare that, an incredible difference. And considering that, couldn't you direct the city attorney to not enforce crimes of personal hygiene? Once a person is arrested, it's not just the additional cost to the city, but it's additional cost to the individual. It makes it harder for him to get a job, get into public housing. If he's an immigrant, he's subject to deportation. A simple direction from this committee to the city attorney, advising him not to enforce such crimes of personal hygiene.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Louise Mabella.
Hi, sir. It's Louise Mbella, the M is silent.
Okay, Bella.
Yes, sir. In terms of item number 6, I'd like to bring the issue of violence inside shelters. Shelters have become very, very increasingly violent. And also, I feel like we need women-only shelters. There's not enough shelters for women. And when there is shelters for women, women are very violent among each other. Sometimes it seems like the streets are running the shelters. I've been victim of crime inside shelters, 38 and Broadway, and I was so traumatized by it. It's like I found myself sleeping outside at the Catholic Church by the courthouse. So please check the issue of violence within inside the shelter. The gentleman was talking about more money for another shelter. We don't need another shelter unless we resolve that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. General Jeff.
Good evening, committee members. General Jeff Skid Row. What I'm don't see in this item is inclusion. Either needs to be included in this request for report back, or there needs to be an adjoining request for report back in regards to the storage for people. If they're just going to come off the sidewalks and they're getting housing, there needs to be some transitional storage facilities to help them transition off the streets into the housing. Because if there's no, if they have bulky items or encampments, they're not just going to let their stuff go, and there's no need to, clutter up their new housing. And so we feel that there's definitely going to be a need to include that. So thank you.
Thank you. Susan Shannon, Janelle, or Jared Ezig Ben Noah.
Hi, Susie Shannon, Executive Director of Poverty Matters. I just wanted to say one thing that wasn't mentioned today is that the homeless community is actually categorized into two different categories by agencies and shelters, which is those who are on state benefits making $800 and more, and those who are not. And the only ones who are really being tracked for housing are people who are getting money from SSI or from CalWorks or from Social Security. So that's something to keep in mind, that when we're talking about the homeless community here, we're not talking, or they're not talking about people who are not making at least $800 or bringing that in a month. I also want to say that there are some huge barriers here for helping people who are actually making that. So I had a woman who was 4 days away from eviction. We kept her in her housing for 9 months. I found her low-income senior housing from a place that the city gave $6 million to a nonprofit developer to create 27 units of affordable housing, but the application actually required that she have a current landlord. We were able to show that she was still in her housing, which was great, but if she was homeless, she wouldn't have gotten that. It's a year later now. Her rent has gone up 6%. She's being charged $25 every month for her cat for a pet rent. And in 2 years, she's going to be out of her housing again and homeless. So when you're giving money to nonprofit developers, you need to make it a stipulation that they not have a requirement to have a current landlord. So these are just like some of the little things that you guys can do as fixes to make sure that there are people who are homeless that are actually getting services.
Great. Thank you very much. Jared?
I visited a friend who was in transitional housing. I knew his apartment number, but I couldn't get a hold of him because you had to have his phone number to ring the doorbell. So this is one reason why people don't want to live in these places, too. You can't have a neighbor if you live in some of these places. I'd like to commend Councilman Mike Bonin for recommending and for sharing his personal opinion that we should all comply with the court order not to cruelly and unusually punish people for being poor. I'd like to recommend that you all adopt that point of view. Continuum of care, continuum of housing options available for people. The first place in that continuum is it's not a crime to sleep in a public place. Why are we even considering a proposal to outlaw sleeping in cars? Why are we even considering that? Make ecclesiastical lots and civic lots available to people who want to sleep in their cars or don't have anywhere else to sleep. Don't even consider a proposal to make it illegal until you do this basic first step.
Thank you. Okay, so we will move that item as directed. Item number 7. We didn't have a card. That was it. Okay. Do you have one? Can you fill one out, please? And we didn't get that. Are you sure it wasn't for 7?
For 6 and for 7.
Okay, we have you for 6.
We have 2 cards for number 7 from you. I'll change them.
Thank you. I'm so
Thank
sorry
you.
about
Go
that.
ahead.
Sorry about the confusion. Again, my name is Deborah LeChevre. Firstly, I want to say Carol Sobel is your best friend in the whole world. Carol Sobel is not your enemy. Carol Sobel is not the devil. Carol Sobel is not a horrible person. Carol Sobel is keeping the city of Los Angeles from making even more horrible choices than it already has.
Yeah, there you go.
This is the whole reason her court cases are the whole reason that this committee exists in the first place, because if she hadn't made a big deal out of the Lamont injunction and the Desert Train and the Jones settlement, then we would just go on, the whole city would just go on like usual, criminalizing, just keep going, because that's even what you're doing now, even with these provisions in place. And anyway, I won't go on more about Carol, because I just want you guys, every time I hear, oh, we have these roadblocks at the Jones Center, our hands are tied, because you know what? You should be thanking God that she's helping you guys do this job, because if she wasn't doing it, you wouldn't be doing this. You would just be going on with the political culture of Los Angeles, just, as usual, criminalizing homeless. And if you really want to stop the shelters, get rid of that vehicle law. That vehicle law, at least in vehicles, people have some kind of shelter. If you kick them out of their vehicles, they're vulnerable, their stuff is on the street, and they can have all kinds of horrible things happen to them. So please deny that law, the two silly options that are...
Thank you. Item number 7, can you read that into the record, please?
Item number 7,
Final item.
motion from Bonin, Cedillo, Huizar, Corretz for Buscaino relative to an instruction to the CLA, CAO, HCID, and other agencies as appropriate to report on the steps and resources necessary to provide throughout the city storage facilities and services such as public restrooms and showers for the unhoused and unsheltered homeless population of the city.
Thank you. Mr. Bonin?
Sure. Mr. Cedillo is a co-sponsor. Did you want to say anything on this before I say anything?
No, go first. Let me see.
Okay. This is a motion, colleagues, which is sort of the next logical step from the last motion, which talked about there needs to be a continuum between sidewalks and permanent supportive housing. Right now, as I said earlier, no matter how much we do, how much money we spend, how fast we move, there's going to be folks living on our sidewalks tomorrow and next month and next year. And we need to plan for that and accommodate that. There are residents who hate waking up to find that there's human feces in their carport. And there are homeless people who hate having no place else to go to the bathroom. There are residents who hate that there are encampments on their sidewalks, and there are homeless people who hate that there is no place else for them to rest their head at night. So as long as there are folks sleeping on the sidewalk, we need to figure out how to deal with that. So the motion Mr. Cedillo and I and Mr. Huizar and Mr. Buscaino put in was to ask for the city agencies to start working together to tell us what steps and resources we would need to provide storage facilities and public restrooms and showers for people who are unhoused and unsheltered. I'd actually sort of amend that direction to actually include something I would have done in a separate motion, but it's been discussed, also include in that provisions for safe parking programs like in Santa Barbara. I've done a lot of research on that, and they've worked very well up in Santa Barbara and in Eugene, Oregon. The one thing that's very important to note, staff, as we talk about storage is we need voluntary storage and voluntary check-in. There are 2 places in Los Angeles that provide storage. A very large one downtown, which is storage for materials seized, and also a voluntary check-in program run successfully by Chrysalis. There is a very small and inadequate storage program, voluntary, in Venice that I started. On Venice Beach that just is insufficient to the need, and it's run basically an hour or 2 a day by Venice Community Housing Corporation with no city funding at all. And we need to get coordinated and systematic about this, and so that it's not just sort of a one-off or something centralized downtown. But the voluntary storage is very, very key, so people can check stuff in and then go on a job interview or go to their appointments with service providers. It's hard when you have to lug a tent and a shopping cart full of stuff to go and try to do case management somewhere or go to a doctor's appointment. And we need to realize that, and until we've gotten everybody off the street, we need to make sure we're doing the right things. So what I'd ask is we add safe parking to the direction, and maybe ask CLA, CAO to form a working group of the relevant agencies and report back to this committee with monthly updates.
Okay.
Ditto that, add water. Add water. It's amazing that we don't have water faucets throughout the city or at public places, libraries, et cetera. We should look at the Bureau of Street Services and our street furniture contract to see if we can amend it to add more public restrooms. It's just as we stated at the beginning of this meeting, there's some basic civic infrastructure that we should be putting in place that would be indicative of a city that was decent and thoughtful for people who are in transition. And that would include clean public parks, clean restrooms at work that are lit, that are open. We heard somebody testify about that earlier. It would include drop-in and access centers. Respondent spoke about people who are really making efforts to transition and change their lives, but they need a place to not only put their place, but put their stuff, but showering, put themselves together, and we should do that. So add that to the...
And that analysis should also, as part of the analysis, it should look at programs such as Lava May in San Francisco, where they have mobile shower buses. We put a motion in, I think Mr. Weezer and I, or Mr. Wesson and I several months ago about that, but it could be folded into that. Metro will provide buses, surplus buses. We have surplus dash buses that could be repurposed for this purpose. So something to add into the analysis.
Thank you. So with that, any other questions or comments? We will, before we go to public comment, have a report back every month on this item beginning in 45 days as the first one. And with no objection, public comment, General Jeff, Mike Russell, Wayne, and Deborah Lashever.
Good evening, committee members. My apologies for misunderstanding the two different motions. Sometimes that happens. One thing to take into consideration is when we talk about public restrooms and showers, that's pretty good. When we focus on public restrooms, with all the billions of dollars of public transit opportunities there, there's zero public restroom access to any of those, the ridership. And so, when we talk about providing public restrooms throughout the city of Los Angeles, that is definitely, something close along to those stops is something to consider. The other thing, in Skid Row, there's 2 Skid Row parks that provide water to the homeless folks, but when the parks close, it's say like roughly around this time, there's zero access to drinking water. And so in the hot summer months, and just like we love LA's weather, but there's a lot of times when the homeless don't have access to drinking water in the night. Leads to a lot of dehydration, and which also then reflects LA County, Los Angeles Fire Department's resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Russell. Mike Russell here. Wayne?
Oh, yes. Well, you got 1 out of 7 right. So, it's not going to win you a batting title, but they should get these 24-hour access toilets out there and increase the storage, especially in Venice. But some of us know, when we attended the last meeting regarding this issue, when the report came back on the storage, there was a lot of confusion about what the actual capacity was in the capacity that they were proposing. So as far as storage, you're a long way away from really having a plan. But at least this item moves forward in the right step. But the way things are looking, I figure by about maybe 2030 or 2050, you should be well on your way to implementing these strategies. So hopefully we'll all be around to see the day it happens.
Deborah?
Thank you, Deborah Lashever again. I commend Mike Bonin for these ideas. These are long in coming. I'm glad that we are including the safe parking. That's definitely needed. The problem is, we need to do this before 5611, before what you guys voted on yesterday goes through. We need the storage before you further criminalize taking people's possessions, not afterwards. This could take many years to figure out some resources and how we can proceed on this while people are still being punished and criminalized and their personal possessions being taken away that they need. We have to stop this way of doing business. It's backwards. We have to come up with a solution first, and then if people don't comply, then we have to look at the consequences for that. We can't criminalize the act first when the people have no other recourse. That is inhumane, and it is cruel and unusual punishment, absolutely. The Lava May thing, we live in Los Angeles where we have mobile shower trucks from the industry. We could easily use those. They use them in Silmar and Sunla and Tahunga. They're easily rentable. Different communities could have them on different days. It's very easy. The bathrooms, we can open them now. We don't have to wait for any resources or any other money. We can just open them right now on Oceanfront Walk 24/7.
Thank you.
And that would solve a lot of the problem for now, and with no extra money.
Thank you. Carl or Cara Scott, are you here? Gina Maslow? Herman? Luis Bella? And Quasi Nkrumah.
Wow, a very severe executive order removing property from sidewalks due to passable property? What about the toilets? Again, what about item number 55 on Wednesday's meeting, slope failure, putting a K-rail there with all the crap behind it? I'm on subject, I'm talking about toilets. But now because of my Department of Justice order by transportation, you will create a restroom that is ADA compliant at Hazard Park. Thank you, Mr. Herman. And the compliance for toilets and addressing our storage, anyone should have a right to leave their belongings in a safe place that they deem safe on a public sidewalk and streets. Anytime you alter a sidewalk and streets for improvement, include toilets and storage, and even better, bike racks. Don't you get it? Duh.
Gina Maslow?
Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Gina Maslow. I am a resident of Venice, and I'm a volunteer. Retired a couple of years ago as a nurse practitioner, and I care deeply about the community. I care deeply about our fellow humans, and as such, I volunteer with Venice Community Housing. I'm a part of the Free Storage Venice, which Councilman Bonin alluded to. We're not the answer, but we are part of the solution, and I would love to see something grow from this. We're a totally volunteer group. We can only stay open 1 hour a day. Now only 5 days a week, and we provide such a service for the 26 people that we provide storage for. I'd love to send you each a little 6-minute video that we put together last year that interviews the homeless themselves and talks about what we're doing and the impact that it actually has on these individuals. And if I could do that, maybe with the city.
Yeah, you could get the information from our city clerk.
All right,
on where you can
I
send
will
it.
do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Luis Bella, Quasi Nkrumah.
Hello, I'm Louise Mbala. I'd like to invite you to connect with some of the organizations I'm a member of. One of them is the Downtown Women's Center. The other group is the Downtown Women Action Coalition. I'm actually serving as the DWAC secretary, and I'm also part of a group called Our Skid Row, which provide an interactive workshop on how they would like to see the community to look like, the community of downtown Skid Row, and how they like to have public showers and where. And that workshop is interactive with the service providers and the Skid Row residents that are housed and unhoused. So can I please give that information?
Yes, you could give that information to the city clerk as well.
Thank you.
And we'll...
That's
we'll
all.
do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quasi?
My name is Kwasi Nkrumah. I'm the co-chair of the Martin Luther King Coalition of Greater Los Angeles, and I don't have a lot of rhetoric to throw at you today because I think that's a waste of time. We all need action on critical concerns, and to us, the greatest critical concern in this country and in this world today is this growing gap between haves and have-nots, elites that are amassing obscene amounts of wealth at the expense of the rest of the population, and growing numbers of people who are being totally marginalized economically, housing-wise, and in every other way. We are unmitigatedly opposed to punitive policies against homeless people in our community. We definitely oppose penalizing people who are forced to sleep in their vehicles. We are opposed to punitive activities against street vendors. We are supportive of the Homeless Bill of Rights. We think that every human being has the right to access to food, clothing, shelter, cleanliness, bathrooms, and medical assistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat Raphael, Andrea Theodore, and Jared Isag Ben Noah.
All right, members of the committee, so we've already talked this over a little bit. The issue with the bathrooms in Venice, we the people of the world, speaking from the streets of Venice, just known as Street Love, we've thought this through and we've come up with solutions. We understand that we can open all the bathrooms till midnight. That's at least till the time the parks are open. And the parks close at midnight, but from midnight we could leave one bathroom open in each of the bathroom locations. And we also understand the reason this became this situation that the bathrooms are closed right now. There's been a lot of seedy activities going on in the middle of the night when the bathrooms were left open. So at this point, we would ask for at least one patrolman to go through there with frequent regularity to kind of keep some of the more negative things that goes on at the bathrooms at night. The thing that we have to keep in mind is that when nature calls, it doesn't respond to the neat clocks that we put out. When people need to go to the bathroom, they need to go to the bathroom.
Thank you. Andrea Theodore?
Yeah, my experience comes as a volunteer in Skid Row, cleaning up streets, volunteering. I have heard the LAPD make comments that it's too dangerous to have more public restrooms in Skid Row. The self-maintaining restrooms are being used for criminal activity. And basically, the LAPD cannot be allowed to make quality of life decisions for our neighborhoods. We need the city council to have security guards by these restrooms if they're so dangerous. And the LAPD has tried to limit trash cans in the past. And, you know, it's up to the city council to step forward and say every neighborhood, regardless of the homeless population, needs a certain quality of life. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Jared?
I'm speaking for Street Love, also representing the PEA and the 1%. I affiliate with Occupy Venice sometime, and I'm the 1%. I'm going to donate a penny to you to start coming up with some common sense solutions for this, because 100% of people matter.
Sir.
And here's one solution.
Sir, I'm sorry. Please do not throw items at the
sure.
desk or at anybody else in this room for that matter. Thank you.
Okay. So, one common sense solution, they do this in Africa and Asia. Build bathrooms with an aperture of 1 foot off the ground, lift them up off the ground so that you don't have less prostitution and drug activity going on in the bathrooms. Redirect some of your police officers to patrol the bathrooms rather than, because street people deserve justice too. We deserve the protections of the police. We're entitled to that. Affordable storage, thank you, Deborah and Gina, for doing something to that end. And yeah, let's give people basic quality of life and human rights and dignity.
Thank you very much. So we will move this item as moved. And last but not least, in some closing comments, I I want to thank my colleagues and the public and everybody who came out. This meeting ran longer than expected, but should I say, we should have probably anticipated that, given that the city is way behind in addressing homelessness as it should have for many, many years. I'm very happy to see the interest by everyone involved and the compassion that people bring to the table to find a better approach to how the City of LA has been handling our homeless situation. I do want to outline for the next 6 months that we will have several meetings, hopefully meet every 2 weeks, and to continuously address this matter. And as I said at the outset, hopefully in 6 months we will have a comprehensive plan in place, which would put us at the end of the year. And today we have set some foundational discussions, and we will bring back those items that we moved today to have further discussions. When we return from recess in August, we hope to hear from city departments and discuss their frontline interactions with homelessness. One of the difficult issues on this front line was discussed in council this week regarding issues of property and our ability to keep our sidewalks passable and clean, and also the penalties associated with leaving property in our sidewalks. That was an item that Mr. Cedillo and others brought up as concerns, so we will have that item discussed back when we return in August, along with a motion that Mr. Bonin presented with respect to making changes, potential changes to Ordinance 56.11. Then we will then hear from our social service partners in the county, as well as private service providers, to see what lessons are out there and what ways the city can better support this work. In September, we will need to take stock of our housing inventory and discuss how we are providing housing and shelter for the homeless. There are a number of issues in this that overlap with larger housing issues, so we are fortunate to have the chair of the city's housing committee here as well, Mr. Cedillo. In October, I want to focus on issues of mental health and addiction, and on the kinds of alternative strategies out there that can direct people toward services and divert them away from homelessness. And we must also discuss governance issues, as several members brought up today, to figure out how we can improve coordination and accountability. And of course, policy strategies and budget implications will come from the CAO report that we will hear from them in 90 days. How long do we give them? 90 days, right? 90 days from the CAO to come back, that we will use as a blueprint to move forward for a comprehensive plan. Any other closing comments from any?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, thank you for your incredible stamina. We went 4 hours straight. We heard a lot of testimony. You were unwavering and very generous in terms of leading this discussion. I think we heard Andy Bale say that it looks at least now, with your leadership in this committee, that we are going to engage this issue, and I appreciate your schedule and your vision on this biweekly timetable. That means that this will not drift away, but that will require us to engage this every single day. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you for all your time. Thank you.